Meeting room. Thank you. First, I'd just like to say welcome back to Dr. Adley. It's good to have you here in person rather than Zoom. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Well, believe me, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Just a quick chairperson's report. Okay. Just a quick chairperson's report with the agenda we have, but a continued big thank you to the staff and their continued efforts in keeping students in school. And a big thank you and a shout out to all the parents and all the students and everyone in the staff that continues to try and work hard to adhere to safety protocols. The State of the Town address, appreciate the opportunity to address the community on behalf of the entire board. And a thank you to First Selectman J.V. Stevenson, Chairman Zagrodzky of the Board of Finance, and Chairman Mulvaney, Chairman of Planning and Zoning. Alan and I also attended a legislative breakfast last Friday, along with many Fairfield County districts. We implored the state representatives to advocate for appropriate funding on education, remove the cap on excess cost grant for special ed services, and some additional topics that were discussed, including the expansion of the open choice program in the region, support for minority recruitment, relief from state mandates, the 180 days and the 900 hours, ongoing support for mental health and social emotional needs, and additional funding for COVID-related needs. So overall, my first one that I attended, but Alan said being virtual and setting up where we broke out into breakout rooms, it was actually a very productive 2-hour meeting. So with that, we will move over to public comment.
If you would like to speak during public comment, click the participants icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Next, click the raise hand option. You will notice a blue hand icon appear in the upper corner of your screen where your face, name, or number appears. When it is your turn to speak, the facilitator will identify you and announce that you were unmuted for public comment. Once recognized and unmuted, please state your name and address. You will have up to 3 minutes to comment. First person for comment is Jonathan Dunn. You are unmuted and recognized.
Good evening. My name is John Dunn and I live at 175 Raymond. During the last meeting, I commented that despite rising COVID cases in Connecticut, we can continue to best serve the needs of our students and children by keeping them safely in school. I referenced that the head of the CDC had publicly stated that schools are among the safest places kids K through 12 can be, for students contracting the illness from family gatherings and local events rather than in the classroom. Since then, Dr. Anthony Fauci, a definitive voice and leader in our fight against COVID, stated in an ABC News interview, quote, "The default position should be to try as best as possible within reason to keep the children in school or to get them back to school. If you look at the data, the spread among children and from children is not really very big at all, not like one we would have suspected. So let's try to get the kids back, but let's try to mitigate the things that maintain and just push the kind of community spread that we're trying to avoid," end quote. We should listen to his message. The science is clear. Darien schools have not been major drivers of transmissions in town. Despite this clear fact, during the November 24th public comments, the head of the DEA recommended that after Thanksgiving, schools should be fully remote through the holidays. Additionally, if that was not possible, she suggested moving elementary schools to the hybrid model. Why is the DEA pushing for a flawed educational model that disregards science and only further disadvantages students? What is their logic here? This type of drastic and unsubstantiated move would adversely impact Darien students and Darien parents. I would respectfully ask the DEA to share any scientific reports or scientific studies they have completed that would support their view. At the last meeting, we were told by the DEA that a mere 5% of the teaching population was out for quarantine reasons. Clearly, this shows the school's contact tracing and safety procedures are working. Anecdotal evidence from the head of the DEA that she saw 7 Darien students unmasked on her Saturday drive to Starbucks simply isn't enough. Our children deserve educators who put their students' best interests first. We must continue to follow the science, disregard the unsubstantiated agenda of the teachers union, and do what is best for our children's academic and emotional development, keeping them safely in school. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn.
Jocelyn Delancey, you are unmuted and recognized.
Happy to speak and share. Jocelyn Delancey, 110 Commons Park North, Stamford, and I'm speaking on behalf of the DEA. In August and September, when we were so vocal, the DEA was working to ensure two things: safety for staff and students and an ability to provide our highest quality of instruction possible. That's our agenda. We are not pushing for a specific model. We were not pushing for a specific model just to ensure safety and quality. Thanks to Dr. Adley and the Board of Ed, we did get many safety measures in place. It's now December and DEA is still pushing for safety and our ability to provide quality instruction. Here's where we are now. For over 60 days, Darien teachers have been in school working at over 200% to provide for your children, making many personal sacrifices along the way. We have had parents get up in public comment and call our concerns baseless and insult our efforts when we teach remotely or in hybrid models. It is disheartening and discouraging. We have stressed from the beginning that live streaming was not ideal instruction. It is much more effective when teachers and students are all on the same platform. Parents, the Board of Ed, Dr. Adley, still think our current model is what's necessary and best. Teachers are concerned and confused as to how what we have in place right now is best. As of this moment, we have 31 teachers out due to COVID symptoms or quarantine. Last time it was 25. One building today had 19 staff out, including 9 classroom teachers and both school psychologists due to quarantine. Teachers, there were building subs who are college students who have minimal or no training on teaching or caring for students during this difficult time. While we appreciate the efforts of these community members to help the schools, we question how this allows us to provide what is best for our students. Another issue that teachers are facing is the growing number of families who are pulling kids to learn remotely in order to jumpstart their vacations and allow for safer holiday gatherings. You have the right to go remote at any point, and teachers understand a family's need for safety. Here is where teachers are feeling not only slighted, but also stressed, sad, and anxious. First, it is not easy to teach kids at home and kids at school at the same time. Teachers take a lot of time to prepare and provide for both groups of students. We're happy to help keep kids safe, but we need time to prepare and an understanding that having students in both models takes away from the ability to provide quality instruction. We have families learning remotely from the Caribbean, Europe, South Pacific, and beaches and ski homes across the country. It's really disheartening to know that remote teaching was such a horrible and ineffective practice a few months ago or to some parents currently, but it works perfectly fine when families want to travel or keep their holidays safe. This practice is allowed. Not all families have the option. Think about the students who have to be in the classrooms learning with peers who are in the car or on the beach. The anxiety around whose class will be next for quarantine grows the closer we get to the holidays. I don't want a teacher or student to have to spend his or her much needed vacation in quarantine due to school exposure. I'm here tonight. Oh, okay. Well, thank you. I implore you to reconsider. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Delancey.
There's no one else for comment at this time.
Thank you for that public comment. Moving on to the superintendent's report.
Good evening, everybody, and it is delightful to be back again in person. I trust that all our families and community members had probably a different, but at least a special Thanksgiving holiday, certainly one to remember. We extend our congratulations to one of the members of the cabinet, Mr. Rudel, our Director of Finance and Operations. Richard gave birth to his son, or sorry, his wife, that's right, beg your pardon, celebrated the birth. We welcome Michael Henry into the world. Certainly nice to have something to celebrate during these challenging times. I want to thank our staff and certainly our parents for the recent virtual conferences. They seemed to go extremely well and they were very well received. I have a funny feeling that there's perhaps some new routines and traditions might potentially come out of this experience as we move forward. I want to take a shout out again to our home staff and the parents in that community for their quick transition last week, where we had a water breakage and we had to go to remote learning. Again, that's the state of readiness that we're in, and also the state of readiness at the parents to facilitate that. I don't know what other reasons we're going to close schools, but I have a sense some locusts are on the way next. That might be the next challenge. Congratulations to our young people at the Theatre 308. the cast of the pandemic project. This was a unique perspective on the pandemic from a first-hand experience of interviews and monologues that they put together from a Darien perspective. I don't know if it's saved right now or not, that people can watch it if they haven't, but I'll try and see if we can get a copy of it. We have wrapped up some of our preliminary, our planning work with the Thriving Youth and the Community Fund for the administration of the Youth Asset Survey for grade 7 to 12. That is scheduled now and it's ready to go for the last 2 weeks in January. Exciting news, Oxridge, the trailer has arrived. So there's activity on the grounds and it's nice to see that that happen. There's a number of seasonal activities going on in terms of the ability to support charities, from toys attached to other experiences where students and faculty members can contribute for those less fortunate in our community and beyond. And we encourage that participation and celebrate that participation. I would like to pose that the board comes together for strategic planning. Board chair announced when the next meeting is. This would have to be a special meeting. The administration has completed its work from this that was sort of outstanding. The next phase of work from the strategic planning committee. So having completed that now needs to come before the board. With your understanding, I will send out a doodle for December 21st or 22nd, perhaps a 2-hour window. Would be a nice dedicated time to focus and to complete some of that work and get our thoughts from the our board members in terms of how they respond to that and have a wee bit more of a focused discussion on it. So it's exciting to see that coming to conclusion because it's going to serve the district well for the next 5 or 10 years. There's a number of COVID items, but I'll address those during the agenda item as such. And I just want to wish the staff and our community, if we don't come together before then, for a healthy and safe winter holiday.
Thank you. Moving on to approval of minutes. We have a motion to approve the minutes of the special meeting and executive session held on November 24th, 2020. Deb Ritchie moves. Second. Sarah Parent. All those in favor? Unanimous. I see Katie's hand there also. The second motion to approve the minutes of the regular meeting held on November 24th, 2020. Do I have a motion? Deb Ritchie, second. Tara Achman. Any changes or
I
amendments?
think we have to make an amendment to some spelling.
Okay.
So just under public comment, I think there are 2 names that need to be updated: Mihapolis and Delancey under public comment.
Okay.
So
Noted.
Approve those as amended.
Okay. So with those amendments, all in favor? That's unanimous. Thank you. Moving on to board committee reports. The only thing I will mention that the next Oxford Building Committee meeting will be this Thursday, December 10th at 10 a.m. to continue to look at the bids that have come in overall, as was reported last night by John Zagrodzky in the State of the Town address. We continue to come in under budget. And Thursday's meeting will also start to move forward acceptance of some of those bids. And to Alan's comment, I like how he said trailer was delivered and not portable. All right, moving on to presentations and discussions. So we have this evening Mr. John Zagrodzky, Chairman of the Board of Finance, and Mr. Jim Palin, Vice Chair of the Board of Finance. My goal in extending an invite to both these gentlemen was to just start the conversation as we move into the budget season. We've worked together the 6 years that I've been on the board here and worked through some challenging times over last year and with COVID coming into play. And but the goal is to continue to work together, keep the dialogue open. And I thought, although some of us may say we've heard from John at the Board of Finance meeting and the town address, he's taken the time out this evening to address the Board of Ed specifically. And we appreciate that, to give his overall view on town finances. And John also brings to the table a view economically of the state and things going on around the state. So, John, I appreciate you being here this evening.
all this fancy technology. We just don't have that. We're kind of parochial on the Board of Finance. So I'm a little nervous tonight, so please bear with me. I appreciate coming to speak to all of you tonight. The purpose, as Mr. Dedeen has said, is to start that dialogue process for the budget season that's about to kick off. And it started on our end with a discussion of guidelines for the budget season that we developed as a board and articulated at our November meeting. And those guidelines we promulgated at that session, and then I reviewed them in some detail in my speech last night. I can go through them again if it's desired. But if I just take a step back in terms of the process last year and then how we should look at it this year, I think Mr. Deneen is right. The main objective as a process matter, I think, is collaboration, communication, and transparency. I mean, the more open and public discussions that we can have about the budget, really for all the town departments, including the Board of Education, the better outcome we're going to get. And we get to that good outcome by making sure that there's an airing of ideas and we're listening to different points of view. We get to that point by not missing something. And the more people who are at the table and have a chance to express an opinion, the greater chance that we've taken everything into account and trying to make the best decision for the town. One of the things I would remind everybody is that even though we may have different points of view about the budget, we all live here, right? Many of us have kids in the school, or we are certainly tied to having a great educational system because, as the headline has been, our property values depend in large measure on the quality of our school system. And so we're all here for the same reason. We're all on the same team and we all share the same objectives. At the same time, these are not monolithic boards. Each board represents a different constituency. As I said in my remarks last night, the Board of Education represents everyone who depends on schools, and that's students, it's faculty, it's teachers, it's administrators. The Board of Finance represents taxpayers, and our constituencies extend beyond the ones that are directly tied to the schools to include town businesses, retirees, others like that. And so I think just because we have, it's not a perfectly overlapping circle, but rather a Venn diagram of constituencies that we serve, there's inevitably going to be a bit of tension or sometimes disagreement as we had last time. But I think the way that we get our minds around that is by having an open and transparent process with as much dialogue as possible, so that in the end, we get to decisions that everyone can support. So that's my general perspective on what we're trying to accomplish. I guess in terms of guidance, just to review briefly, we divided the guidance into sort of three parts this time. The first part of the guidance, as I described last night, is this notion of core operations. So your existing or incumbent staff levels, programs, initiatives, that type of thing, anything that exists today. Our sense is that a target of 2.5% in terms of increases is a good starting point for budgeting that part of your operations. And we say that because if you look at data and spending data historically, these numbers, about 2.5% actually is not inconsistent with what we've seen over a long period of time, as I showed in some of my charts last night. And so as a result, we feel that that is a good starting point for those core operations. The second part of my guidelines were around new initiatives. So when there needs to be something new, and by that I mean new staff, new programs, new capital spending that's not bonded. Those types of investments need to be made every year. There's no year that goes by that there's not something new that needs and requires investment. And we think that that's something that we should always consider and take a look at. And our guidance there is simply to make the case. If you feel that the budget needs to go substantially over or even a bit over the 2.5% guideline for core operations because you need to make new investments in programs, that's perfectly fine. We'd like to hear about it. It's important, as I said, to maintain our school systems, and that costs money, as I said last night. Between those two, core and sort of new initiatives, our sense is that an overall guideline of 3% is a good starting point. As I said last night, it's not a cap. It's not saying that you can't go over that, but it's also not a blank check and something that simply can be ignored. We'd like to see not just the Board of Education, but the Board of Selectmen, all town departments strive to meet a budget that looks like that so that we have something that feels like 3%. And if we need to go over that, then so be it. But let's talk about it and make sure that we're collectively in agreement that that's the right way to go. Finally, in terms of COVID expenditures, as I said, I'm hoping that the heavy lifting for those is behind us. To the extent that it is not, it's an imperative, not just for the Board of Ed, but for the Board of Selectmen to do everything that's required. There are state and federal requirements for these expenditures in terms of standards that need to be met. But beyond that, we want to make sure that the health and safety of everyone who has to interact, whether it's at a town level or between students and faculty, that we meet the needs of those individuals and protect them at this difficult time. So when you have those types of expenditures that you're also needing to budget, do what's required to help protect and preserve the safety of everyone. Try and benchmark it against what other towns are doing so that we get to something that feels right, and make sure that we do the right thing for those we're trying to protect. So those are my general points of view about the process, guidelines. If anyone has any questions or would like to engage on that, I would be happy to do that. Jim can also speak as well.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. We have not seen the budget. Dr. Adley and his team are organizing the budget right now and will continue to do so and build a budget that's right to deliver the education that our students deserve and expect. And we'll look to see what investments we're going to make in the education budget over the course of the next budget cycle. So thank you very much. I'll open it up for board questions, comments.
Just,
Richie, Mrs.
will
Ritchie.
you be posting your presentation from last night online?
I believe that's done every year with all those presentations. I haven't checked with town staff to see exactly when that's going to happen, but the answer is absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs.
No,
Ockman.
no charge, by the way. I know people want to pay for it since it's such high quality, but for you.
It was exciting.
Mrs. Ockman.
I agree that in terms of communication, that's probably best served for our thanks. That's probably what's best for the town. As a point of clarification, Board of Education represents more than school families. We represent all citizens and all taxpayers in Darien. So we're in the same boat with you on that. We have slightly different duties. In order to do that, we have to put forward a budget that's both fiscally responsible and pushes education forward for children. So I think that's the difference, but it's not just school families. We do take into account all members of the community. And I think we're best served when we have our really productive work sessions. I think that those have yielded really good understanding and actually good questions from the Board of Finance for the Board of Education to consider. So I just want to make sure, I know that COVID posed some hiccups last year, that we are committed this year to a solid work session between the Board of Education and the Board of Finance on this budget.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ockman. Any other questions? Mrs. McCammon.
I would be interested in a board in talking about the most effective way to talk about those work sessions. They happen a little late in the process, so where they are scheduled. I know we have a budget calendar, and ultimately we, I think that makes sense as a more formal piece. But have we, as a board, I would be interested in talking about what our touch points look like with the Board of Finance along the way, so that they are brought along on the process. We tend to get a nice formal list of questions, but I think there's an opportunity to talk about how we communicate between boards as we pass. And I don't know if other board members have any thoughts, whether we want to invite the Board of Finance, to continue to invite them at strategic points and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's a good point for further discussion. I will say there's been some comments from folks. We're going to have to look at the technology around our Saturday meeting, the kickoff of the budget cycle, and how we work through Zoom with making sure all voices are heard and that we get all questions to us. But I think, we can have further dialogue around that. Any other? Yes, Mrs. Ockman.
So I think the only point to that, and we can look at the schedule, which is why we approve a budget calendar in public, which is what we've done, is that we need to remember the budget at this point belongs to the superintendent. The Board of Education has not made a decision. Once the budget belongs to the Board of Education, that's the appropriate inflection point to go out to the Board of Finance. Inside of that period, I think the board has some flexibility other than the actual vote by both by the Board of Finance to talk with the Board of Finance to come up with a good time. But it's only after the budget's ours that we have the authority to do so.
Mrs. McCammon?
Certainly, I hear your point. I think that there's an opportunity to, without ceding our authority, to just make sure that the conversation is inclusive. That's all I'm asking for.
Yeah, and I think the dialogue will continue with the Board of Finance, with John Zagrodzky and Dr. Adley and myself and the full board. Any other? Mrs.
I
Ritchie?
would just add to that respectful of the Board of Finance and their position, we also have the RTM to consider. So
Correct.
as we go through these discussions, we have to make sure that they are also included because they are a very integral part of the process. So I just wanted to add that.
Absolutely, and that's some of the comments from some RTM folks around how does the technology look around the kickoff to the budget session. So, Mr. Zagrodzky.
Yeah, if I could say, I mean, I think one of the challenges, a part of this is that the relationship between the Board of Finance and RTM and the Board of Education budget, it's different, right? You guys decide what you're going to spend, and that's it, right? Our sole sanction is to come in and say, for the aggregate budget, we believe that that budget should be cut by X. Now we can talk about various elements and sort of defend why we did that. And we could actually come in and say that the reason we didn't like that is because of program X, right? You went out and spent on that and we didn't like that program. So we're gonna cut a dollar amount that's equivalent to that. We can talk about that, but that's actually where our message ends. You could actually accept that cut and cut that program, or you could cut football, or you could cut teachers. That we have zero role in that decision. And so it set us up for kind of an odd dynamic last year, and I want to explore ways to resolve that. In past years, at least in the years that since I've been chair, we've not cut the Board of Education budget. And so these education sessions where we've gone in and listened to you guys, none of that stuff was really controversial because in the end, it helped us make an informed decision that we were okay with the aggregate spending level, and there was no suggestion of spending that gave rise to some concern, or there was no sort of town imperative that we felt that we needed to reduce spending. This past year, that was different. And so when the specter of that came up, there was suddenly a cry as, well, wait a minute, we've not clearly had enough time with the Board of Finance. We need to have these working sessions to defend these programs. And so that type of impetus never came up in prior years, simply because the specter of a budget cut was not part of the discussion. And so that's why it was different last year. And when that came up, and then there was this pressure to have these discussions, yes, in retrospect, should we have had more of that? Clearly. And so what I want to make sure we do this year is there's plenty of time for that. And I'm happy to let you guys come in and explain things, or set up whatever forum, not just with you, but with the public, to make sure they have a chance to interact as well. These are public boards, and we should do that. At the same time, I recognize the Board of Finance's role, which is simply to decide whether the aggregate spending is adequate or too high. And if we think it's too high, we'll cut it. And we will spend as much time as we need to with you all to educate us to the contrary. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that.
Thank you. Any further, Mrs. Parent?
I just want to make sure that we're all understanding and just maybe clarify our roles a little bit. That the superintendent's role is to create a budget, and our role is to approve a budget that does what is right for our students, for our staff, and for our buildings. And I just want to make sure that that is our focus going forward, and that we're not maybe artificially backing into a number and trying to fit things into that. I just want to make sure that we're doing what's right for our education and moving our district forward at the same time.
I believe in all my conversations with Dr. Adley, that is the commitment of the budget he's going to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to bring before the board the budget I think is necessary for the school system and for the kids. I mean, that's what you would want me to do.
Thank you. Mr. Sini.
I would just add to Mrs. Ockman's comment to what Sarah mentioned, is we also have to consider the taxpayer as well. They are our constituents as well, along with those other priorities. And I think this is where the discussions are important from a top-down perspective. I guess my question to you two gentlemen is, when you look at the budget guidance of 2.5 core and 3% total, how much of that was reflective of our last several budgets, which I think net OpEx growth was about 2.4%, the budget which was approved maybe, in that general range, and how much is prospective in what you're looking at the economy and what you're looking at tax receipts. You talked about the general fund also. Maybe just give us a little more color on how you guys came to those numbers.
Is this on?
Yes.
I would say that the guidance is a combination of looking at the past budget. It's both the gross budget and the net operating budget that you ask for every year. Looking at what's been budgeted and what's actually been spent, but also looking at what's in the recent contracts that have been negotiated with the teachers, the administrators, the nurses, and other sort of non-certified staff. That sort of all comes together. I think that's, that's the guidance we gave for budgeting. In terms of how we finance that, it can be a combination of taxes, bonding, and the use of, if we believe that there's excess in the general fund, we can use some of that to finance it. But it's a combination of both, and it's trying to be consistent across both the town and the Board of Education side. And one thing I would just point out on the process, which I think has been part of the process for the past 10 years, and it will be part of the process this year and going forward, is that while you all are discussing the superintendent's budget in January and debating it yourselves and putting it forward, the members of our board are either at those meetings or watching them on TV and listening to the superintendent present his priorities, understanding how the 9 of you discuss and ask questions and think about that. And so we're shadowing you through all those decisions to help us make a better informed decision when ultimately it gets to us. We make our decision in early April.
Yeah, to add to that, in my first State of the Town address, one of the things I talked about was what our sort of extremely high level goals as a town should be. And so if you think about our sort of competitor towns like a Westport or New Canaan or Wilton, those types of towns that are all kind of in the same area, same demographics. Would we want to come out and sort of be 10 or 20% less expensive as a town on a per capita basis than those other towns? No, right? I mean, we're all kind of providing the same sort of experience and education. So the notion that we should be trying to spend dramatically less money or any of that sort of thing versus these other towns is not the case. But what we should aspire to is being the town that when you look at that group of towns, if you had to point to one town that delivers services the most efficiently, people should immediately say Darien does that more efficiently than anybody. And I'm talking about student experience, delivery of capital projects, efficient deployment of town resources, just processes at town hall. Everybody should look around and say, yeah, the town of Darien is the most efficient deliverer of town and educational services of any town in that group. And so I say that because what I would encourage you to do is to try and instill that mindset, not just in this group, but everybody who works in education in this town, teachers, staff, anybody who's spending money or thinking about how to do something. My message to all of them is, yes, we have to deliver a top-notch education product in this town. The fact that you've done that for so many years gives the Darien High School the ranking that it has based on what Mr. Deneen said in his talk yesterday. But ask yourself, what could we do to deliver that excellence more efficiently than any other town? And from that, you get to budget numbers that will start to make sense because it's not just a top-down guidance from the Board of Finance. It's a bottom-up mindset of everybody who's working to provide education in this town to deliver that with just exceptional efficiency. And I think the more of that mindset that can be instilled in everyone, you get to meet your objective of the education that you want and that parents demand. But you do it in a way that everybody points to Darien and says, nobody does it as well as they do.
Any other questions, Mrs. Ackman?
Yeah, so I think kind of what we're saying is what we would like is this process to be formal and stylized as demanded by statute, but not prickly, like you're touching a cactus every time we get together, right? We want good relationships, but I think part of that is understanding the roles. I think we hear your efficiency. We talk a lot about efficiency here. We also have to realize that students are sometimes inefficient as lovingly we grow these children. But so I think our role, as John said, is to understand the economic environment that we are creating a budget to move education forward. And so that is really our distinct role, to look at education, what do our kids need, and to not do it in a vacuum that we don't understand that our taxpayers have to put this money forward so that we're responsible. And I think if we do that job, by the time we come to you, you really can come and say, hey, look, these are the economic pressures, or like now you're delivering us some of what you think the economic pressures are to come up with these numbers, so that we're not doing that within a vacuum. But I do think those distinct roles are really important, because it's kind of the balance that the legislature thought when they envisioned this whole process, and that our charter envisioned. So I think this board is committed to moving forward a fiscally responsible budget that takes into account our need to educate our children, however they might come this particular year. And then, we're open to a dialogue for you about what are the effects and what can the town afford. I think after that, we just don't want to blur lines too much.
Thank you, Mrs. Ackman. Mr. Sini?
Yeah, and I think part of the problem with the reduction in the increase process last year was, one, it was uncommon. Two, COVID hit after we set our budget. So it's kind of a fire drill, unfortunately, amongst the pandemic, which we've never experienced. Hopefully it will go much smoother this time around. Good.
Well,
Any other comments or questions? Mr.
I
Zergotsky?
could just add to that. I mean, that was a difficult time and it was controversial, but one of the things I said repeatedly in public meetings, right? So the Board of Finance comes up with a budget cut for the Board of Education. I said repeatedly, if it was determined by the Board of Education that that budget cut was producing significant harm to the delivery of educational services in this town, I would be the first person to immediately convene a session of the Board of Finance to consider an appropriation request to make sure that didn't happen. Purpose of that budget cut was to try to drive efficiency, to try to drive further this mindset that I'm talking about. And I think that it had the desired effect in terms of how that budget cut was handled. I mean, there was spending out of the surplus that was for that year, I think of around $500,000. The rest of it was contract savings and reduction in budget control. So in terms of that cut that we put out, forcing a dramatic reduction in Board of Education spending is just not true. But at the same time, even if it had done that, and even ex post, if you'd come to us and said, look, there's a real problem, you guys need to address that, we will be the first ones to jump in and make sure that doesn't happen. I say that not just to this board, but to anybody in the public watching. As I said before, we're all on the same team. We all live in this town. We do not want to harm the education budget, okay? I do want to create some tension. I want to put out this message that emphasizes the need for efficiency. If we see things that smack of not doing that, our job is to point that out. And hopefully that as we do that, we get to what I said in my talk last night, we get to the best solution of the town. It's by those groups getting together with these types of natural tensions, irritating questions, all of those things. When we get through that process, we end up with a better product.
Thank you. I think we look forward to the superintendent's budget that he will deliver with us, and we'll look forward to continuing the dialogue and going through the budget process. Thank you, Chairman Zagrodzky and Vice Chairman Palin.
Okay. Thank you, friends.
Thank you. Next, Dr. Adley.
I'm looking for a few substitute teachers tomorrow, gentlemen, if you're
No.
so inclined.
Oh, no.
Next up, update on school opening. Dr. Adley.
I'll move through this pretty quickly. After the Thanksgiving break, we actually had a wee bit of a, I won't call it a lull, but we were bracing ourselves for sort of the next wave type thing, and it didn't exactly come as quickly as we were thinking that's the case. It wouldn't seem that way, the number of reports that you get in terms of updates, and certainly the last 2 days, and I would say particularly at Royal, have been challenging it in that regard. But we haven't really felt that wave just yet. If we are to believe everything that people tell us, it is coming, particularly certainly after the holiday break, the winter holiday break. The COVID cases and metrics, just to give you a little bit, this is whenever the board packet was sent out. So just for consistency, that was at the end of the day, Thursday. That number 16 is actually down to 10 today of active cases. And the current quarantine is down from 137 to 127. So those two particular columns have changed, and the cumulative quarantine has gone over. It's 900. It's basically another 100. It's 960. So you can see, to some degree, the number of actual cases that we have, and certainly we've had to quarantine a number of people. The cumulative cases of quarantining, essentially, it's 2/3 are students and 1/3 are staff members in general. That's kind of the way the quarantine is sort of breaking out. Darien cases have increased significantly, as have most of the other towns around us, and Fairfield County and Connecticut has changed. On the phone call this morning with the Department of Public Health, they reiterated that these numbers are not to be just looked at in isolation. In fact, they were actually talking about sunsetting that particular addendum, but it's still useful in some capacity. The quarantine requirements, as of, we are actually waiting today. They'll maybe come out as we sit. CDC, as you probably have heard, are changing their quarantine guidelines. We aren't doing that until we hear from the Connecticut Department of Public Health. I don't know why they came out last week. I don't know why we didn't receive them today on our weekly phone call, but they said we would receive them by the end of the day. I think essentially what it's going to do, and I can't really say for definitively this, but from what I'm hearing, it sounds like the 14-day quarantine is still going to apply to elderly health facilities and so on. The 10-day quarantine will likely apply to schools, recommended to apply to schools, and the 7-day with a test after the 5th day might be applied. So if that's something completely different, you'll forgive me, but that's what I generally am hearing on the ground with it. But as soon as they come out, we will circle with our medical advisors and make a recommendation to follow from there. Athletics is basically status quo at the moment, although there is some conditioning that is allowed to happen, and we've run that by our medical advisors and Alicia and the high school administration. So some of that conditioning will actually take place. Testing of staff is an ongoing discussion. As of today, again, reviewing it with our medical advisors. There's different ways of doing this. The general feedback, again, I am not a medical doctor, so I have to lean heavily on their expertise in that regard. The general sense is that it's not that helpful if it's not done on a very, very regular basis, and regular being minimally weekly. The cost for that, if you were to do it, is going to be around $36,000 if you had to like fund testing all the staff. And then what do you actually get from that? So the response back from again our advisors are that's not a practice that they're actually recommending from our medical advisor and also the director of health here in the town.
Cost weekly, or
that's what it costs if you want to test the entire staff. Essentially, it's $36,000. Now you can offer staff other things where you can have kits that get sent home and so on and so forth. But if you want to administer it yourself, that's typically the price. If you want a kit to be sent home to people, it's basically anywhere from $100 to $150. There are outfits that do these and provide these opportunities, but essentially, if you're talking about a program in town that we are going to test everybody, I mean that is kind of what it's going to cost you. So that's cost aside, it's not even recommended. So it's just I can't bring that forward as a recommendation for us to consider, given not even the cost, but just the recommendation given getting back from our medical advisors that that's not a viable or necessary or particularly helpful process unless it's done so regularly. And the related expenses are as they were reported out at the last Board of Education meeting and also at the town meeting last night. So we are at with the net cost being basically 224, the gross cost being 3,000,002, and the net cost being 2,000,004 after grants and transfers. But that was reported out at the last Board of Education meeting. We did have for the first time today We did have 2 college students who did supervise a class with guidance throughout the day from our staff for a teacher who was for teachers who were actually instructing kids in the or instructing their classroom because they were actually quarantined. We're looking at that very carefully, right? The Royal School was hard over the last couple of days to actually staff. I mean, it will be the honest answer that in order to, if we were to change something, it's more likely to be because we can't staff it than it's not safe. Because again, as of today, I'm getting the feedback again as to it's the safest place to be. We are not seeing the spread in the schools. So therefore, the recommendation at this point is to continue in the model that we have. But I would ask for the board's understanding, the community's understanding. Look, I do feel we have probably about 500 kids in any given, between 480, 520 in any given week who now are remote learners. We have about 90 of those who actually are stepping out because of the holiday and they don't want to miss the holiday. And they've been honest about that. So I can understand a wee bit of frustration, I do, because we are trying to provide an in-person experience. And we would ask people to actually participate in that as best as we're expecting them to participate in that. When you don't, it just makes it all that more difficult, certainly for our staff. So I understand that to a certain degree, but during this period, however, that's the way we set it up, right? I mean, that is the way that we set it up, that you can transition from one mode to another with notice. It's not the easiest thing to do. I would hope that people would send their children to school if that's what you've been doing. But that being said, that's just another data point on part of the story here. So with that, I'll stop talking there and entertain any questions that you may have. Alicia's on Zoom also. But if the board has any questions about anything about COVID, certainly we can address those.
Dr. Adley, someone brought to our attention the signs up at the high school, I believe, about fields closed. Could you just give a quick update on that?
I don't think that field's closed.
But there were signs up there that someone took a picture and sent in to us.
Of it being closed?
The sign up on the fence said fields closed.
Like a new sign?
I don't know whether it's new or just a picture that was sent in that I forwarded to you.
Well, those signs, originally there were signs up there some time ago whenever the field, I mean, technically the fields are closed to some degree, right? Technically they are, unless you have booked them.
I just want to confirm that they should be up there because people are questioning with the amount of activities that are going on up there and seeing signs that say fields closed, what the actual messaging should be.
Well, the fields are generally closed unless people actually want to book them. Now, we don't stop residents going up there walking around. We don't even stop some young people going up and playing around, right? But we did put up, at least I think they're up or they will be up, new signs about wearing your mask and keeping your distance. And that was done in collaboration also with the town to try and help consistently send in the message as best as we can without being too prescriptive. I'll have to look at this.
Okay.
I'll have to look and see what that
Sure.
said.
No, thank you. I'll open it up for board questions. On the opening, Mrs. McCammon.
Alan, could you give us, I saw in the personnel report that we do have at least one new IT technician. Can you give us just a brief update on IT and perhaps a little more information next time we meet about how we're doing in that department, the kinds of, whether or not we're not working 7 days a week and 14 hours or we are, and I'd like to know how the Chromebooks are doing and then also how we're doing with the tickets.
So I can just say I will certainly bring you back more information, but generally it's going much better. The pressure has been lifted off. We have one of the personnel on board. We're still looking for another member to work with the elementary schools, but in general, it's working much more smoothly at this point. I need to check on the actual number of tickets. But
good.
Sorry.
Any other board questions or comments?
Mrs.
Ackman.
Dr. Ali, can you talk a little bit more about testing? Because We did hear the 36,000, but we also heard that the medical advisors don't recommend it. Can you talk why they don't why they're not recommending regular staff testing on the medical side as opposed to the financial side?
So I'll say it's just a point in time, and then I'm going to defer to my medical expert here, Alicia, if you don't mind.
I think if I understood our conversation with them earlier today is that we need to be doing that on a regular basis. And being able to test everyone on a regular basis, you have to have a program in place. And those costs are, the benefit that you're getting from spending that kind of money, $36,000 every time you do it. If you're doing that weekly, I don't think that they feel that it's providing you with any additional safety in the schools. I think that there's a lot of discussion around the Binax Now testing, which is the free testing that's been purchased by the government and being distributed to a lot of the school-based health clinics across the state. Those health clinics have the infrastructure in place to be able to provide that kind of testing, but that testing is the antigen testing, which should be used for individuals who are having symptoms. And it also hasn't been tested in more than, I think, if you read the labels, over 100 people, and it hasn't been approved for kids, hasn't been approved for 18 and under. And so since it's really meant for people who are having symptoms to have that test done in the school setting, it almost is encouraging people to send their children to school sick. So that was kind of seemed like it wasn't really the most viable option for the Darien schools. We don't do any diagnostic testing, health testing in our health offices. And so I don't think that necessarily is a viable option in Darien. If, we can continue to investigate it and figure out how we would do that if it made sense. And then the other testing is just the logistics around having the ability to test a large group of people, and who's going to pay for it.
Yeah, I think that's really the point I'm trying to make clear is that this isn't about, Darien being grinchy and not wanting to spend the money. It's about the cost benefit analysis here. The costs outweigh the benefits. I think by the fact that we've spent $3.2 million, we've shown we're willing to invest in making our schools as safe as possible, but this wouldn't be a good use of money to achieve the desired health effect. That's what I want to hear. Like, I think this board is committed to keeping our schools safe. We just want to spend that money as wisely as possible to actually achieve that goal. So if what I'm hearing is that money doesn't really achieve the goal we're looking for, then I'm comfortable with it.
Mrs. Ritchie.
Alicia just actually answered my question, because I was going to ask about the state provided tests and how we could, if we could even incorporate that. I guess what I'm thinking as we're having this discussion is the test is only as good as the day you take the test. I mean, ideally, it would be nice to have everyone tested before they come back into the district, but that is probably not going to happen. So all we can do is request that people follow the current guidelines and take responsibility and keep our schools as safe as we possibly can. Thank you, Alicia.
Mrs. Stein, I keep looking for you to make sure I see your hand if you raise it, but speak up if I miss it.
I will. I'm good right now. Thanks, Dick.
Mr. Brown.
Quick question, Alicia. The number of people that have been quarantined for contact tracing, do we have any numbers? How many of those have actually wound up being testing positive for COVID?
So I have kind of a rough number for the kids in the classes and adults that have been quarantined as a result of a case in school. We really haven't seen really anyone test positive. The other day, maybe in the past week, I've had one person that was out in quarantine, but there was more exposure outside of school, but it's hard to know whether or not that was due to the in-school or an out of school exposure. And then there was one earlier in the fall that was a little questionable to me, but also both people who tested positive had exposures outside of school. So it's very difficult to say, but I would say, you know, the majority of people we've quarantined have not tested positive or developed symptoms.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Richard.
Dr. Adley, the numbers on remote learning, could you I just was trying to jot them down and did you say we have 400 remote learners right now, but 100?
So the last official number was I think it's 523. That's the last official recorded number.
And then of those, you said there are
But 90,
No.
sorry, finish your question.
Well,
That's
maybe
right.
you're going to answer it. Maybe
Sure.
there's a group of people that are doing it to be extra cautious regarding the holidays, so they've chosen to move their children into
Yes.
remote. Is that
Yes,
what I'm
and
hearing?
that's, yes. And
And how many do we know? How many people
about
have done that?
90.
90. Okay.
And God bless them, they've told the truth, right? They've told us. But anyway, yes, that's the answer to your question.
Okay. I just wanted clarity on that. Thank you.
You good, Mr. Brown? Good.
The only other thing I would mention is some of the quarantine stuff, and I'm sort of, sometimes it's complacent, right? And I say that just with not excessively so, right? And sometimes we just have to correct things the same way as you do in your own household or when we're asking people, right? So some practices we continue to revise and learn from and try to make sure that we too are following everything we have to do. There's unique situations that come up that we look at, and we're just making modifications as we go.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Steeney.
One
last question.
Quick last one. On the Royal, you mentioned Royal a few times in your comments. I mean, in the ability to staff that location, could you just go into a little more detail and how tenuous that situation might be for that school?
When you have an excess of a dozen staff members who are impacted, now a dozen staff members, you may think a dozen teachers, but it may or may not be a dozen teachers, right? It might be. But there are services that weren't provided there today, for instance, and yesterday, because we were trying to ensure that the kids have classroom coverage, right? That was the priority. You can't just go on like that indefinitely, right? So at some point you have to sort of say, are they getting the full education? So that's a conundrum. But when you just have a case that impacts so many staff members, it's just hard to function whenever you've got principals who are actually in the classroom. That's not what we want to do. I don't want to put, in this case, 2 college-age students, even though we did provide additional support for them. So I just have to make sure that we don't compromise the quality of the experience we have too. But just simply the more staff members that are out, the harder it is to run on a functional day.
Does our model allow, or our plan allow you to shut a school down for not just one day, but several days to account for those difficulties in operation?
So I don't have to go back to, for instance, I don't have to go back to our medical advisor. I would just as a courtesy. If we're going to close down because we're changing into a different model, technically, and I would anyway, I have to go consult with them. But if I can't if we can't open a school because it's not safe or you can't function, right? Then I have the ability to close that school down.
Okay, so you can take a single elementary school offline.
Yes.
And you can move it into remote, right? I mean that.
Yes, they're ready to. I mean, people are ready to go at remote at a moment's notice.
Mrs. Ackerman.
I just want to be clear in between Dr. Adley and Mr. Tranberg, maybe you can help clarify this. At the moment, though, we feel like we are delivering our educational services at all of our schools with full integrity, which is why all of our schools are open.
Yes, with the caveat that, for instance, today, I know not all the services were delivered. However, they will be delivered.
Yeah, so that you can model it,
Yes.
within a 24, 48-hour period. At the moment, we feel like that the quality of the education being delivered to the kids is not being compromised any more than COVID as a pandemic is forcing us to.
Correct. And if it gets compromised to the point where I feel as if it is compromised, then I'll have to make a decision.
Okay, thank you.
All right. No further questions or comments. Thank you all. Moving on, discussion and action on acceptance of state project 035-0016 RR Central Office Roof Replacement Phase 1 of 1 as complete. Mr. Lynch, this is reading of a motion to accept this project as complete. So I'll read the motion. Whereas the following project, state project number 035-0016 RR, received local approval from the Darien Building Department, Darien Health Department, and the Darien Fire Marshal. And whereas the following project number 035-0016 RR has been completed, and whereas the Darien Public Schools Board of Education has assumed all responsibility for the project, now therefore be it resolved that the Darien Board of Education formally accepts project number 035-0016 RR Central Office Roof Replacement as complete. Do I have a motion? Mrs. Ritchie, second, Mr. Maroney. All in favor? Mr. Sini? That is unanimous. Moving on, presentation and discussion of transportation study. Mr. Robert Jacobus, school bus logistics, and Dr. Adley.
So I'd like to welcome Robert from School Bus Logistics. I also want to recognize the work of Chairperson, who's in our transportation department, and also again Mr. Ruddle. So this has been going on since last year, if you recall. We wanted to revisit this in time for the budget process. We're pleased tonight to bring some options before the board. And Robert's here tonight from School Bus Logistics. He's the president and CEO to make his presentation to us this evening. Robert, I think I can see you. Welcome to Darien Board of Education. It's nice to see you. Thank you for your work, sir. We have had a couple of conversations. I know you have had many others before that. So thank you, and we look forward to what you have to say this evening.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Adley. Yeah, as I mentioned, or as Dr. Adley mentioned, thanks for inviting me from Denver, Colorado. We're here to talk about what the impact would be for a school bus impact analysis for the walk zones. And then if we can get that presentation, there you go. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the analysis was to discover how many buses it would take to transport additional high school students within, by reducing the 2-mile walk zone from down to a 1/4 mile, a 1/2 mile, and a full mile from the existing 2-mile that you have today. So what we wanted to look at, and what we'll talk about tonight, is how many buses it would take for additional transport of high school students within those 3 scenarios and what the impacts would be. And then also what would the impact be if we got creative and played around with bell time changes to provide a zero cost or neutral, zero neutral cost transportation option. So we did look at those as well. Next slide, please. Headquartered in Denver, Colorado, we do analysis work all over North America and Canada. And here are kind of some major school districts that we've worked with. Some specifically in your neck of the woods, Cumberland, Rhode Island, Holyoke, Massachusetts, and your closest neighbor, New Canaan Public Schools, that we looked at last year by doing a bell time analysis for high school students coming in for a later start. So that was the closest one for your school district. So we kind of do analysis work all over the country. Next slide, please. The current bell structure allows school buses to be used multiple times is the best outcome. And for the purpose of this, a bus run is a segment of a leg of a route. A route is a compilation of runs morning and afternoon that makes up the entire route for the day for a particular bus and driver. So kind of a little bit of background of the difference between a bus run and a bus route. Currently, the district operates a 3-tier bell system. First bus runs are for high school and middle school. The second bus run services Henley, Royal, Tokenique elementary schools. And then the buses go back out for a third set of schools in the morning and afternoons for Holmes and Ox Ridge. As of this year, the district operates 25 bus routes. This is an increase from 1 from last year. So this year, the district implemented an additional bus for high school students south of the I-95 freeway. We'll get into a little bit about that in a few slides down the road. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the runs and routes. This is just kind of a sample fleet schedule out of the Versatrans routing software. The colored boxes are the individual runs. Yellow boxes are high school, green boxes, the light green boxes are middle school runs, and then we can see the additional runs that make up an entire route. So that's kind of how the current routing scheme is for the school district as it is today. Next slide, please. To begin the analysis, we did load count analysis work on the high schools. So you can see here in table 1, we have the high school routes. Then we have eligible students who are eligible for those routes. And these eligible students, high school students, are students that are 2 miles outside of the school walk zone. And then we compiled actual ridership to see what percentage of high school students are taking advantage of the bus service for each route. And as noted on this slide, the snapshot of data provided from the bus company was pulled from November 2019. So what we wanted to do with this data was to look at how could we use the existing route and the capacity of the existing routes to see if we decrease the walk zones, how many additional students could we put on the existing routes without having to add more routes? And we'll talk about that shortly. Next slide, please. Option 1, reducing the walk zone from 2 miles down to 1.75 miles, increases 1 full bus route, and adds a potential 100 new eligible high school riders. Now, keep in mind, the district already implemented an additional bus for this year. So the 100 riders would be about 82 riders south of the I-90 freeway, where most of the students would be included in this option. And there's about 18 additional students, high school students, that are north of the high school that could go on to existing routes. So there was no additional route needed for the area north of the high school. Option 2 reduces the 2 mile walk zone down to 1.5 miles. This increases 2 full bus routes and increases an additional 180 new eligible high school riders for this scenario, or for this option. Again, 21 students, an additional 21 students north of the high school, 52 students west of the high school, which would create 1 bus route, and 107 students south of the I-95 freeway, which is the other 2 buses. And again, keep in mind, the district has already implemented an additional bus south of the I-90 freeway for some of those students. And then option 3 is reducing the walk zone from 2 miles down to 1 mile, which would create 7 full bus routes, an additional 495 students. So that's about 60 students per bus for that area. So those are the breakdowns of options 1, 2, and 3. Next slide, please. Option 4 is getting creative with bell times. So what we did as a group, we met every other 2 weeks with the transportation, with Richard and the finance department, to look at, well, what else could we do for providing bus service for some students south of the I-95 freeway without adding any additional costs. So one of the things that we wanted to look at was to move Royal Elementary School to a later school start with the other 2 schools that start at 9 o'clock. And then by doing that, we are able to reduce buses for that school, reduce 4 buses for that school, and create 3 buses for that school to help us create express routes for the high school. And what an express route for the high school would mean would be 3 buses would go out in the morning and pick up some high school students south of the I-95 freeway at a hub stop, for example, Baker Park, pick up a group of students, take them into the high school, and then go service another high school bus route. And then in the afternoon, three buses would go pick up students, take them to Baker Park, go back to the high school, and then take more students home. That would create a zero cost for the district by moving Royal Elementary School and then creating these express bus routes. So that was one thing that we wanted to look at. So we were trying to figure out what options we could do by not creating any increase in cost. The other option is to move all of the elementary schools to the same tier. Move all the elementary schools to a 9 o'clock start. What impact does that have? And that would increase 2 full bus routes, which would be option 4. And by doing that, that allows more time between the first set of schools, which is the high school, middle school, and more time for all of the elementary schools on a second tier, such as a 9 o'clock start. Option 5 would be doing a little bit of combination work, changing bell times for the elementary schools to be on one tier at 9 a.m. and then also reducing the high school walk zone down to 1.5 miles. And that would also increase an outcome of 2 full bus routes. Next slide, please. So what else could we do after reviewing the Royal elementary school is we looked at evaluating all of the elementary load counts at the elementary schools. So currently today, there's only about 30 minutes in the afternoon for the high school buses and the middle school buses to get to an elementary school, which doesn't allow a lot of time to load a school bus up to 60 students and take them all home, because obviously the more students you have on the bus, the longer it's going to take students home. So some of these buses are short with very few students on them. And I say very few students, we're talking anywhere from 15 students to maybe 30 students. For example, Ox Ridge on this table 2 shows that currently it takes 11 buses to take those students home, just because there's less than 30 minutes to get 321 riders home. But if you had more time, you could fill up those buses and take those students home on 6 buses. So by moving the elementaries to the same tier allows more time between the high school and middle school to service those students. So that's why we have 43 buses today to take home the elementary school students versus the 26 buses if we were to put all of the elementary schools on the same tier. So this kind of snowballed into, well, what if we looked at Royal and looked at the high school load counts, let's evaluate the other load counts at the elementary schools to see what the impact would be for the walk zone analysis. Now, some things that could happen is we could have a little bit longer ride time for the elementary school students if we moved them all to the same tier at 9 o'clock. Anywhere from 45 to 50 minutes, some of the students could be on the buses for, or less. It just depends on what that bell time shakes out to be. Next slide, please. Thank you. And what we also did in the analysis was to kind of research what your neighboring school districts do for walk zones, just to see what other high school students are doing for 2 mile versus 1.5 miles and 1 mile. So this is just an analysis of some neighboring school districts on what the elementary schools and the middle schools and the high school students do for their policies. Next slide, please. Questions? Dr. Adley?
Anything to add, Dr. Adley?
Well, I will talk out the options first. I think will be helpful. Certainly, the finances associated. I can't help but consider those. Each bus, and for the most part, each bus is just under probably $90,000 or so. So when we're looking at it, we just have to keep that in mind. You'll forgive me that after the discussion we just had from the chair of the Board of Finance, and also what I'm struggling with right now in terms of the budget and making the numbers work. But that being said, I'd be happy to engage in a discussion about the various
So
options.
I'll open it for board questions.
Oh, I have a question. Sorry.
Yes, Mrs. Stein.
Hi, sorry. Can you just explain in better detail this express route to the high school? And is that something we could do on its own? And would that help us?
Sure. The express route would be, the concept was if we moved Royal Elementary School to a later start, that opens up some opportunity in that second tier to double up 2 high school runs. A short one, which would be an express route, which would just fill up the bus, high school students south of I-95, and then in that area, and then drop them off at a park, and then just return to the school, and then pick up a bus route and take them home. I do know that there was some conversation with the high school AP or the principals about, how would you feel if high school students had to wait around for a school bus to come back and get them? And there was a concern about that. Because in the morning, we would need to drop off a little earlier before the bell, and then go back out, pick up that park, Baker Park as an example, and then take those students up.
But what I would say is that a lot of high school students do, under normal circumstances, go into school early to meet with teachers as early as 7 a.m. But you're saying there's no way to do it without changing Royal's schedule. We couldn't do it.
Correct.
Okay.
We would have to move Royal to a later start to open up some of the holes in that scheme.
Mr. Sini.
Dr. Adley, what's been the experience of the added bus this year, and how that has been utilized?
It's been a hard year to assess that, given it. But generally speaking, I think that bus was scheduled for about 80 or so, give or take, right? At the time, there was about 60 using it. Right now, we're down to probably 15 to 20, maybe 25 on a good day. But it's hard to, honestly, all the buses are down. So it's hard to gauge people not wanting to put their children on the bus this year. It's just a tough year to do that. But that was basically, it was budgeted for about 80 or so students.
Mrs. Ackman.
So it's funny, I think the bus model, it dovetails exactly into what we were talking about with the Board of Finance. In the 7 buses is a lot of points on our budget. At the same time, any plan which looks efficient that puts elementary kids on a school bus for an hour starting late and getting some of these kids who are really little home at 4:30, 4:45 in the afternoon is really probably educationally not sound for them. You're going to have a lot of little people falling asleep on buses. So I think, Dr. Adley, we can look at all these options, but are there some that you would just kick out because they just don't make sense for school districts?
Well, I think things like considering putting all the kids on the same route for potential changes in schedules. I don't know that it's the wrong time to do that, in my opinion, right? I just don't think that's necessary. I personally look at option 2 as something to actually look at. Now, bear in mind, that's actually, if you include the fact that we are in our budget, our modified budget right now is a bus. Right, so you're looking at two more buses under that scenario. So
over and above that.
Over and above, all of these numbers, add 1 to them. I mean, that's really what you have to do So I have to sort of balance that with just the actual budgetary implications of it. But the idea, to me, the idea of south of the interstate is a pretty good idea, right? I like that conceptually. Because if you don't, we can still just do what we're doing now. But there's other people, you could consider Avalon is on the other side, but the distances, and I just, there's other things to consider in that regard. So to me, I like number 2, but even now I'm going, I don't have 2 more buses in that budget number. That's really challenging at the moment. That being said, we entertain the discussion, but I think that the concept of that one appeals to me because it's sort of clean, and we can continue to do what we're doing now under the superintendent sort of exemption, so to speak. But then, you could potentially have another 100 kids who could ask for the same thing, or a number of families ask for the same thing. I don't think those are exams, hopefully.
So the concept of the express bus or a hub, is that fully vetted in that if we decrease, my experience sometimes being in town during times when buses are around, there are a lot of stops.
Mhm.
So, and a lot of that might have to do with elementary schools, which is something different. But from a high school standpoint, are there hubs or areas where buses can park there and we collect the students that solve some of the challenges?
Well, the thing that I didn't really like was the thing that Rob actually talked about, that the kids have to hang around, that the high school kids have to hang around. They're not going to hang around, okay? I mean, we
No,
actually-
I wouldn't want them hanging around for 30 or 40 minutes. And then you get into a conversation of what's available to them. Is the school open? No, in terms of picking up or dropping off, are there parks or destinations that they could meet at that would solve some of these problems?
I'm not, Rob, have you looked at that?
You had
We
mentioned
did.
the park.
Yeah, we did kind of talk about, what safe areas could some of these students wait south of the I-95 freeway, and then, add in a couple stops rather than doing a stop every other block. Maybe add, 2 or 3 stops to help with that walking distance. But yeah, we did talk about that and look at that.
Is that in option 2?
It can be an option too. Yeah, we didn't go through an analysis to say this would be a stop, this would be a stop, or this would be a stop, but we did just talk about that this is the numbers. But then, transportation and the bus company would have to deem, where these stops would be safe for students, large groups of students to stand and park a bus to load students.
Sure.
That'll take about 2, 3, 5 minutes.
I do, but I think Ms. McCammon had a question.
Mrs. McCammon.
Well, it was, thank you. It was related to yours. So did you look at sort of hubs as not just for south of 95, but anywhere to see if maybe not loading an entire bus, but we could have maybe a neighborhood of kids? Was that part of the scope of what you looked at in terms of bus efficiency, particularly for the secondary school?
No, we did not. We didn't look at the other routes and where those stops are. We just kind of focused on decreasing the walk zone and then how we could get some of those high school students south of I-95 on a bus.
Mr. Brown.
Hi, Robert. Quick question for you. This hub idea, is that, and I know we have to do more research on that side, but from your practice and your experience, since you're familiar in this area, is this something you see in a lot of other districts? Is this a new thing that people do, or is this, I'm just not familiar with, if you could talk whether this is common or not common, or, some information would be very helpful for background.
Oh, sure, very much so. I think we're looking at that more and more for efficiency standpoints, because obviously when you have a bus that stops 25 stops, it takes longer to stop, put the red lights on, get the students loaded, making sure everybody sits down, and that takes time. But if we could get students to walk a little farther to a stop and then create less stops for a route, then obviously we can have shorter routes, which we could do more efficient work with. Yes, it's a very common practice that's being done and being implemented across the country, yes.
Got it. And one other quick question is, I don't know, in your studies of the Baker Field example that you had used, was that just purely on distance, or was there any sort of traffic study? Because I know that time of day, it's not as quick as it might seem on a map.
The traffic study, I'm not sure if there was one done in that area. I know that there's Kate can answer to some of the traffic studies that have been done in the past. I don't know if it's been done in this area, but just trying to find a safe spot, like a parking lot for a bus to get off the main road and for parents to pull up and wait in a car during bad weather. So parks and church parking lots are ideal, just because of that safe loading zone and unloading zone of the parking lot, and for other parents to wait in cars.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just wasn't sure how far you guys drilled down.
Sure.
Very much of interest. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mrs. Dockman.
So I have to say, I'm sorry if I'm beating a dead horse. I get a little concerned when we're having this conversation, but it's like, I don't have room in the budget for buses. And that's my concern. And I know it's not what you mean, Dr. Adley, but if we're backing into a number and yet we're concerned about the safety and the walking radius of our parents, that's where we get caught. I agree with you that there's a limit, right? I mean, we have to be smart and sensible. But how do we have this conversation if we're saying we can't afford a bus? So the answer is, if we need a bus, we're going to have to go make a good case for a bus. It's not that there's not room in the budget. We just have to really flesh it out and know why we're asking for it.
Mrs. Ritchie.
I would just add to that, I guess, I don't know when we have this part of the discussion, but I would like to hear how Dr. Adley feels about the safety aspect of this. Are you comfortable with the current policy that we have in place, which is 2-mile walking for the high school students? And that sort of should be the driver of this discussion, the safety of the children. And, you know, we saw it with the parents from south of 95 and their concerns about the safety of their children walking. So I think as we have this discussion, and I thank you for this report, it's excellent. It's great information. And I agree, I like option 2. And in a perfect world, if we didn't have to worry about budget constraints, that's the option I would go with. But I guess I want to have a discussion about safety. And as a board, where do we want to see that policy? Are we changing our policy as we go through this process?
Well, we would change the policy, obviously, if you change the distance and so on. Last year, I was able to say that I believe the route was safe. Now, I think we have to be pragmatic here. There are different degrees of safety, right? We all live with that and make decisions all the time around that. I felt comfortable that it was safe. If we want to remove that completely, the whole I-95 discussion and take it offline, I think that's another level that you could go to and just remove it all. So if we could do that, I would do that. That doesn't mean to say that the current route or what we had the previous year was not safe. I said at the time it was safe. We did some of the other studies with the police department, so on and so forth. Is it ideal? No.
But I think part of the reason we added in the bus,
Yeah, Mrs.
correct me if I'm wrong, was that we said we were adding it this year, given that that corridor was having a fair amount of construction and work. You
Correct.
see it up by the Chase Bank now, you see it down by the Walgreens and the Stop and Shop. That bus was added because the walking conditions were being significantly altered. So there's two things going on here. We added one bus because of the situational. And then I would say, does the board want to change its policy because we feel the 2-mile radius is too much? Which is what this study is taking into account.
Mrs. Parent.
I just say thank you for this work. It's really educational for me. I would agree that option 2 is the ideal in my mind. I agree that the south of the 95, is that if that's the cutoff, definitely makes sense. And I think the Newton Avenue walk, we kind of solved that with the other bus, but there's the other side. There's Hollow Tree. There's the it's coming up from the west side as well. I definitely think it's something to think of, and I agree with Mrs. Ackman and Mrs. Ritchie that backing into this, thinking about it financially, it's a struggle for me. I mean, if this is the safety and the wellness and the ideal situation for our kids, then it's hard to. I'm having a hard time reconciling it personally.
Mrs. Ritchie.
Oh, no, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay. Mr. Sini.
I mean, bottom line, it's a policy discussion that we need to have. And,
Right.
Beyond the safety issue that was the temporary safety issue that was called out due to construction. So, I think this was good to kind of frame what the possibilities are, but we're going to have a policy discussion now on whether or not we need to rein in the 2 miles. I mean, the 2 miles is not extraordinary relative to our peer districts either. Some of the shorter ones are much more rural kind of districts, if I will, or maybe less dense districts. Rural is probably a little too aggressive, but dense districts. So I think, we got to kind of take a good hard look and see if we want to change the policy.
Yeah, I think Mrs. McCammon.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I have 2 questions just about some of the content of the report. The first is your chart, your snapshot of data from November 2019. I assume that's probably on a decent day where we would have a certain number of kids walking or what have you. But one of the issues we have with many of our schools is spikes in capacity. So I'd like to know if we were to have, say, a snow day, we had to get all of our kids out of the high school at once, would that impact any of the further information that you put together? And the second thing I'd like to know is if there are any particularities to Darien that you would raise compared to some of the other communities you've looked at?
Yeah, as far as the numbers that we looked at for November, I think we probably could go back and pull more analysis and data from the bus company on actual ridership. I know that the data that was compiled, they gave it over a week, and I took the highest possible ridership for each possible day, so that it's giving us morning and afternoon, and your ridership is higher in the afternoon. So I was able to take the highest possible ridership. So yes, we could probably do more analysis on the ridership data. The other thing that most school districts are doing now is opt-in transportation, and they're signing up for the bus. And opt-in transportation obviously helps any school district plan for better routing and efficiencies. So taking that opt-in data and then planning those routes would be ideal as well. And what was the second question? Comparing
Whether there were any particularities to Darien that you would raise versus some of the other communities you've looked at?
So the other communities in Connecticut that we've done was just the walk analysis and the radius, where there wasn't any drill down in comparing this district with other districts on this part of the analysis.
Mrs. Ritchie.
He answered my question. I was going to ask
Great.
about opt-in.
And we can move on, Mr. Brown.
I was actually going to take advantage of Robert's experience. What is opt-in? I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with it.
I apologize. Opt-in is where the students go online through the district portal and sign up for the bus if they're eligible, to say, yes, I would like to take the bus. Because if the one table shows, you have 116 eligible students, but only 30 sign up for the bus. So therefore, you can plan for 30 students versus trying to guess on 116. But
so I'm sorry, just how often would they do that? Is that at the start of the year, like every week, or every day they go in and out?
It would be the start of the year. Some districts kind of revisit it after so many semesters and then have them go back in and evaluate that and look at that. But that's something new that a lot of districts are doing now ever since COVID has started.
So we did, Dr. Adley, we did do that to start out the year. correct?
Well, for this purpose, yes. Yes, we did. For COVID, we did.
So
Good.
in-
Mrs. Dockman.
in Connecticut, education's guaranteed, and it's been interpreted that transportation is part of education, and therefore opt-in systems have not been allowed in the non-COVID environment because, or let me put it this way, if someone requests transportation at any given point, you
Correct.
must provide it.
Right.
So opt-in could give you a snapshot, but if anyone changes their mind, at least in Connecticut, California is a little different. But at least in Connecticut, at any point, should someone in the district need or request transportation, it must be provided.
And that's how we're doing it. That's how we're doing it currently here.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes,
Mrs. Karen.
Is there any way going forward, in the next 6 weeks or so, to survey those families that would be with, if we knocked it down to 1.5 miles, to see how many would be, of the high schoolers would be opting into a bus, to figure out, how many? Is that something that we could
Well,
do?
we basically know the numbers now, right? But you're asking, I guess it's a bigger question of like, do you want to ask everybody?
So I think the next move here is, I think it should be looked at in terms of the next, having a policy discussion around it and what the administration thinks around that. I think it should be safety. I think it should be the distance that seems reasonable. I think the dollars and cents should be taken out of it. If what we come up with from a policy standpoint and from a safety standpoint makes sense, then it's our case to look at it from a budget standpoint and put it in there. Mrs. McCammon.
Thank you. Just one more question, please. It doesn't have to be answered now, but if we just take crossing 95 off, how many buses does that require? So it wouldn't necessarily, we could change the policy to account for not crossing 95 without changing the walk radius potentially. So I'd like to know what impact that would be.
I believe it depends on which option we're looking at. If we decrease the walk zone from 2 to 1.75, it doesn't increase anything, taking out south of I-95. going from down to 1.5 miles, it adds 1 bus to the west side of the district. So there would be 1 bus increase there. And then I'm not quite sure exactly what it would be to go down to 1 mile, but it would definitely be a couple buses north of the freeway, maybe 1 or 2.
So
Mrs. Ackman.
I will get better at it, I promise. So I hear what you're saying. I think then what we would be doing is defining a hazard.
Correct.
And then I think what we might have, I can imagine like the people on the north side saying, well, I think my blind curve is also a hazard. So I do think any policy should be broad enough to take into account hazards. I'm not sure we want to start defining specific hazards, but that would be the broader policy conversation.
Is there any board discussion around having further information around the whole hub concept at the high school and looking at specific routes where specific to a distance groups could gather for pickup?
I mean, I'd be interested in hearing about any efficiencies that are possible within, the safety constraints we have. To Mrs. Dawkins' point, we may not, we have an obligation for the transportation, but we also have an obligation to send buses where nobody's going to be standing for months either. So this would be an interesting thing to pursue. I also don't know if First Student has chimed in at all, and if they would perhaps be somebody we should hear from, if they have any suggestions or optimizations or things they've seen in their professional experience.
Mrs. Ackman.
Sorry, Kate, you might know the answer to this, but I believe when you and Rich do the bus routes, you try to take into account where you can group students, correct?
Yes. Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, that's correct. I have very painfully for some parents initiated cluster stops to try and make the buses more efficient on the middle school and high school level, more so than elementary.
Okay.
So are we looking at defining much bigger hubs than we already do? Is that the request?
I open it up for board discussion.
I think I'd love to understand what we're doing today and whether there is, what the impact of opening it up larger would be.
I agree with that.
So Kate, you have that data on how you have it set up now in terms of those cluster stops. And we could look to see if there's the opportunity to increase or change any of those cluster stops to add any type of efficiencies to the routes, while also looking at potentially option 2 and decreasing it to 1.5 miles.
Yes, unmute me.
That makes sense.
I have to be
We can hear you.
unmuted.
Good. So then I think,
I'm sorry.
thank you. So then I think,
Yes, I would have that information, Mr. Denis.
great, thank you, Kate. So I think this has to come back to us with some guidance from the administration as to what your thoughts are around the policy. Again, taking the safety in first, thinking what is the right mileage, and then we'll understand from that what the costs are and have that conversation. Mrs.
I
Barrett?
just want to clarify that we're only talking about the middle and high school routes, and the elementary start times and everything is remaining the same, that those options are off the table.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, option two would give you an option down the line. If you want to do that, you can still do that.
Right. Good.
I just
Mr.
have
Maroney.
One question on this. Do we have any idea of when we're talking about these children in option 2 that are going to potentially get on a bus, if they're in the walk radius now, how many of them actually walk versus how many are getting driven to school?
I'm not sure that I would know that one.
I don't know how we would track that.
I don't know either, but I think to me, this is the question that we're also not talking about is the traffic at the schools. And if we try to understand what that would do to the traffic. How much would it lessen or not?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think the goal is always to get as many on the buses as possible and eliminate the amount of drop-offs and pickups that we have. I think that's just changed in this past year from a COVID standpoint.
Yeah, if you just have if you have certainly 3 buses going to high school, 3 additional buses, it's going to help.
Mr. Sini?
And I just want to kind of review why we went through this study. It was one, as I understand it, one group from one area that created the need to discuss busing. Was this part of any of our priorities or policy review prior to that discussion? And I talk about that group in that I-95 cluster.
No, I think that exactly sums up how we got to the point of looking at this study.
Yeah, so the question is, I mean, again, from a policy perspective, you know, two miles has worked throughout most of town. I don't think we heard from a lot of parents outside of that cluster area that face those challenges, temporary challenges, especially around the construction in which we added the bus. So, you know, I think as a board, we gotta, you know, are we moving to 1.5 miles? We need to have a reason that we're looking to change the policy beyond that cluster area that did have some specific safety issues.
To my knowledge, it's been a little cyclical. It tends to happen in neighborhoods. A few years go by, the concern comes up in neighborhoods again. So recent, yes, but I think the board, oh, Mrs. Stein's not here, but Mr. Deneen might remember. Oh, you are here. Sorry, Katie. But it's popped up before, but
Yes.
Just that area recently.
And
In my
hence
memory.
it sparked this study,
Yeah.
I think, too. Okay.
I think it in my 6 years, it comes in cycles as certain groups of students move through the different schools, move up to Middlesex, move up to high school. So
And I do feel every once in a while, we start talking about the policy and whether it's appropriate and it needs to be revised. I do.
So I would look for any further comment or questions, you know, from the board, send them in, and some guidance from the administration. And we'll see when we get this for further conversation around if we want any changes in the policy and the recommendation on that additional bus.
Yeah, I just have to work with the time frame. That gets a wee bit tricky. I understand that, you know, bringing it this time is triggers that a little bit, but we did the best we could under COVID conditions and stuff. But so now it sort of like rolls into how I frame it, not because of the money, but I have to frame it. It might be and it might not be, independent if we get that cycle. That we're going to have to finish up the cycle to make a decision.
Right. Understood. And I think we've solved for the challenge that was presented to us in the fall. And that continues to work.
Correct.
All right. Any further board questions or comments? Mrs. McCammon?
At the risk of diluting another effort, we do possibly meet in a couple of weeks for the strategic plan.
Yes.
Perhaps would that be a time when the board might want to hear back in the spirit of trying to keep to a timeline? Up to you guys. But
I would look for guidance from Dr. Anley. There's a lot going on as we march into the holidays. And
There's a lot going on. Yes. I also heard the board say go back to the policy committee. Is that correct?
Yes.
No. Being on the
Well, I think it's a policy
The board,
conversation.
yeah, it was a policy conversation. Nothing's been prepared to, no questions been handed to the policy committee yet, I think.
Right. Okay. So we're coming back to the board.
Yes.
Well, I'm not saying, but I think what I heard here is the board has to discuss the policy.
Right.
But you know, if you want to take it. So.
Yeah, I just don't know if I can. I just don't know.
I think that's on. Yeah. With everything that the administration has on its plate right now. All right. Thank you, Mr. Jacobus. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Robert, thank you. We'll be in touch. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Kate, thank you. Yes, thank you very much.
Moving on. Looking for people. I see Mrs. Klein up in the corner there. Annual special education update. Mrs. Shirley Klein, Mr. Scott McCarthy, Ms. Kristen O'Reilly, and Ms. Laura Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Deneen. Good evening, everyone. Dr. McCarthy is going to operate our screen, so if he will put up that screen for us. I think it is for those of us on remote. Thank you. And if we can just say good evening to members of the Board of Education, families, school community members, and colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity to present this evening. I'm just going to close this. I apologize so I can see the whole screen. Thank you for the opportunity to present this special education program and overview this evening for the 2020-2021 school year. Our program directors are here this evening to share their expertise and information on special education programs and services for our students in Darien and answer any questions that you may have at the end of our overview. As we begin our presentation this evening, I just wanted to begin with a humble acknowledgement that this year we asked our colleagues, teachers, clinicians, paraprofessionals to learn a new language in a day, and that they did. We asked them to shift their teaching and learning methodologies and strategies to a one-dimensional screen with very little lead time, and that they did with extraordinary ease and methodology. So thank you and acknowledgement to all of our colleagues in general and special education. Our department structures, as you can see on the screen, Laura Straighton is our program director for ELP and works with the school psychologists, special education teachers, speech and language pathologists, and our paraprofessionals in supporting our ELP program. Kristen O'Reilly is our program director for our K-5 program. She works with our SES facilitators, Catherine Natali, Carolyn Hote, Shira Schwartz, Christine Pachetti, and Joanne Vordren in implementing our program successfully in our grades K-5. And Dr. McCarthy is our program director from MMS and for DHS, works with grades 6 through 12, and works collaboratively with Teresa Fox, our department chair in Middle 6, and Christina Bross-Taylor at Darien High School. Each year we remember to give you a glossary of acronyms to make some sense out of some of the language that we use in our presentation and as we refer to them as we go through it. We hope that it's helpful at the end. You may want to hold on to this, but you'll see acronyms that really talk about supporting our program and students here in the special education department. When we look at our continuum of services, our program overview, we look at the most least restrictive environment and the continuum of services of students who require more services. As we go through our respective programs in our respective schools, we'll speak to the individual programs, but just at a glance to understand that we start with our least restrictive, which is speech therapy as a special education service. We'll look at our supplemental services in our ELP programs, as well as our K-12 programs. We'll look at co-teaching in Middlesex and Darien High School. We'll continue to look at our supplemental services of resource rooms, of learning centers, of direct reading instruction, and some of our programs in secondary of AIM program and the core program. And we'll look at our modified classes for students who require specially designed instruction in the content areas in both Middlesex and at Darien High School. And we'll look at our DLC programs that are housed at Oxbridge Elementary School and Hindley Elementary School to really talk about supporting our communication programs for students in the early years. Let's begin with early learning program overview. And many of you know this is one of our most exciting programs for our earliest learners. Our integrated preschool for children begins from ages 3 to 5. We look and support children with learning differences, and they're working in an included environment with typically developed peers as well. Laura is always reminding us that we still have a play-based learning opportunity for students to be creative, to be inquisitive, to be reflective, and to enjoy learning. Our emphasis in our early learning program is on the cognitive, social, emotional, behavioral, and linguistic needs of our students in a developmental model. For our youngest learners also on the continuum of services, and Laura will speak later to this, is looking at the different programs that we have available. Our programs, referrals can be made from our Connecticut Birth to 3 system by parents and pediatricians. The Darien teams then evaluate the student in the area of a suspected disability, and if appropriate, we develop an IEP for those students. The programs that can be provided include our itinerant services, and those are for our students who are attending community preschools, our 16-hour program, which is an integrated program, our 20-hour program, and our 22.5-hour program. All our programs are provided related services and accommodations, including speech and language therapy, counseling, OT, PT, teacher of the hearing impaired, and teacher of the visually impaired. When you look at the design of our programs, everything revolves around students. We look at our support for teachers, we look at support for school psychologists, speech and language pathologists, OTs, PTs, our behavior analysts, and our paraprofessionals. And when we design our professional development for the year, we really look at the needs of our students. And as we look at those needs of students, If we look at the fields, the first being teaching and learning, we look at early detection of literacy differences. We look at project-based learning. We look at developmental teaching. When we look at continued understanding of supporting our staff in the most current methods of applied behavior analysis, and also looking at the Autism Curriculum Encyclopedia and ongoing training in ACE. When we look at social emotional learning, we look at what we can utilize in our early learning program. We look to second steps, we look to responsive classroom practices, and we look to social thinking. Much of the early learning program is about communication, and we make sure that our SLPs have a robust and current training in methodologies, including oral motor protocols, prompt protocols, and looking at an augmentative alternative communication, as well as assistive technology. We continue our robust training for paraprofessionals in RBT and PMT to support learning behaviors for our earliest learners. And we look at looking ahead and this year's accomplishments. We know that our ongoing professional development with Dr. Gillis and Literacy House Specialist has really focused on developing early reading and literacy skills in our youngest learners. We've utilized a coaching method. We've worked on building toolboxes for our teachers, having methodologies and strategies to support the acquisition of early literacy skills. And in looking ahead, we're going to continue the important work that Dr. Gillis has begun with us and her associates. In light of COVID, we've learned to really understand and how to use instructional technology in Seesaw and Google Classroom. We recognize that this is hard work with our youngest learners, but we need to find ways so when we do have to shift to different platforms or do have to consider alternatives, that we have somehow managed to support our families and our students in using technology when necessary. We'll continue with our RBT training for our paraprofessionals, and we'll also continue really looking at best practices in monitoring student progress. As we mentioned over the last couple of years, we've been using Connecticut DOTS in making sure that we understand the growth and development of our students and looking at language, literacy, cognition, and social emotional learning. When we move on to elementary school, again, we look at our continuum going from least restrictive to students with more needs, and we look at specially designed instruction in grades K through 5. Again, planning and placement teams are responsible for developing the IPs for our students, the goals and objectives, and then recommending the appropriate levels of programs. Again, we look at speech therapy as a special education service. We know our teachers have supplemental supports and they're able to push into classrooms on the general education level in all our elementary schools. We also know that we have pull-out programs of the same supplemental services in our resource rooms, which allow for direct and explicit, specially designed instruction in a small group in a resource room setting. In our specialized programs in our elementary schools, and those are, again, are housed at Hindley and Oxbridge, we do have modified curriculum. We look at a language-based program that really emphasizes communication. We look at social skills, adaptive living skills, academic and physical development, and again, our emphasis on communication. We utilize strategies of ABA as well as inclusive practices. The same commitment to PD is in our elementary school, and when we look at the different areas in literacy, we continue to look at multisensory reading programs. We have several of them listed here. We look at differentiated instruction in mathematics, such as touch math programs and Do the Math. We look at support for our speech and language pathologists, which includes prompt therapy as well as oral motor protocols, and looking at alternative communication devices as well as picture exchange, our PECS programs. For social emotional learning, we really do emphasize, again, our training for support services, our PMT. For our clinicians, we're going to continue our DBT on the elementary level, as well as training our administrators at the same time. So some of our accomplishments for 2021, again, looking at, we had to shift platforms and look at what we thought instruction used to look like and what it looked like during this time. We had to understand how remote learning platforms really would promote and facilitate social groups, how we could do push-in services and delivery of related services using Seesaw, Zoom breakout groups, and other electronic platforms. We do know that For looping and grouping, which is something we really are committed to, it did narrow our parameters due to cohort needs of safety, health, and practices. So as we'd like to loop our students with teachers year to year, we know some of that wasn't available to us this year, again, to enforce our safety protocols. What we were able to do and be creative was when it came to transition planning. In transition planning, we really looked at how we could use Zoom to zoom into classrooms, to do observations, to do site visitations, to observe small groups and clinical groups with students. In planning for their transitions from ELP to DLC or DLC to MMS, we wanted to make sure that we saw those students, observed them, and could make the proper and appropriate recommendations with a seamless transition. And we were able to do that, thanks to everyone's effort. We're excited in one of those multidisciplinary reading programs. We are continuing with our Wilson certification courses. We do have 10 staff members this year who are participating in the certification level 1. We are excited to continue to work with Marilyn Friend. It will be remote. She will not be on site this year, but we've already begun to look at adapting practices for specially designed instruction in our upper school and our elementary school. Marilyn is helping to really work with us to look at SDI in elementary schools and what best practices should look at. Looking at push-in models, looking at pull-out models, and looking at our cohort of students and how we can best address their needs. And in our community-based collaboration, we continue to work with CDSP and CPAC with meetings. We continue to have school-level coffees that are usually staggered at different buildings at different times. And we've been able to have remote family town halls this year to really support and work with families to maintain a communication and design when we shifted from hybrid to in-person or from remote to hybrid, to make sure that we had those town halls available for FAQs with families as we all transitioned to new platforms together. Looking ahead. So when we look ahead and try to remember that we have a nexus between our elementary, our middle, and our high school programs, we do have aim to core from Middlesex to high school, but we don't currently have a program that has that level of social, emotional support for students on the elementary level. We recognize it does look different this year. The entire emotional needs of our elementary students has been exacerbated by COVID, and we look at a different measure of time. But even prior to COVID, we did want to really look at the emotional needs of our students and the kinds of programs and opportunities to really address their needs. So that will be a needs assessment we will be conducting this year. Skill development opportunities for generalization is something that we really began last year as well, to really look at students are able to have discrete instruction when they go into their specially designed programs, when they're in resource rooms, when they're in related services, but how do they really generalize those skills when they go into the general education classroom? So working in concert with the general education teacher, finding ways to monitor that and making sure that we've given students the skills to generalize in their classrooms so they can be successful. We always continue to look at data collection systems and IEP to find ways to really measure student progress, to work with families to understand that, and looking at systems, how we can do that at the same time we do our IEP progress reports. And we're excited, again, we're continuing our DBT bi-monthly team meetings with administrators and school psychologists. This is our 1.5 years of coming into it, and we're excited about the progress we've seen and the impact on students. Our special education assistant principal proposal is something that will be looking ahead and discussed at the budget meeting. We do know that it was presented, and the notion is that it's something that would really support instruction, would support the opportunity for the PPT process and all of the current roles of the SES facilitator, which also includes ensuring and monitoring compliance, facilitating the coordination of special education process, assisting with revision and finalizing of IEPs. But beyond that, the special education assistant principal, because they would be an administrator, would be allowed to really provide evaluation observation of teachers, to look at SDI and to implement it in the classrooms in a direct way, to really look at the decision-making opportunities of PPTs for SDI and what it would look like. So we hope to have a different and more robust conversation as we present in our budget cycle. As we move on to Middlesex and the Continuum of Middlesex, we look at our co-taught classrooms as the least restrictive environment where we have an English language, arts, and math. We currently have resource room instruction, especially design instruction for our students in all grades 6, 7, and 8. We also have our academic and individual management program, AIM. Again, we spoke about that earlier, about social emotional support and programming. Our AIM students spend the majority of their day in general education, but they have the opportunity to come back to their AIM program for a learning center and or for social emotional support throughout the day. We go on to our ALC2. Those are modified courses. They're taught by a special education teacher, and they're really looking at grade level curriculum that is modified to support the differentiating needs of students. And lastly, our Academic Learning Center, our ALC1, is a program that is modified content. We also emphasize vocational living skills in curriculum. We also authorize cognitive and linguistic and communication. And we also really look at having inclusion opportunities for our students in all aspects of Middlesex. And our accomplishments for this year, continue work with Marilyn Friend, again, adapting to COVID times and looking at how we can facilitate coaching and working within the special education classes. We've had to learn how to use Zoom breakout groups to really facilitate parallel lessons. We're not at station teaching yet, but looking at opportunities to really use remote learning to be able to take what looks like a very traditional classroom right now. You know, we've shifted from student-centered learning to teacher-directed learning, but how can we somehow capture and use our platforms not to compromise the importance of student learning, student-centered learning? We've also looked at mini lessons and aligning them to objectives in all our instructional models, using our PLCs for interdisciplinary pre-teaching and post-teaching in our resource rooms, and also finding approximation of community outings and ways to really do that support for our ALC classrooms. Since we can't go into some outside libraries or different areas we've been able to go to, we have some inside approximation, like our Tasty Thursdays, that we really work within the school to really support what would have been community outings. And in looking ahead, we'll continue with our DBT implementation of successful group formats that we have. We are going to do a needs assessment on our modified courses to see the need for those ALC2 classes. And we're looking at opportunities for scheduling group counseling and social skill cohort opportunities. And as we move to Darien High School, looking at our continuum, we continue with our co-taught classes in ELA and math. We have our learning centers that really work on pre-teaching and post-teaching. We look at our creative opportunities for restructuring education, our core program. Again, our students spend the majority of their day in their general education classes, but have the opportunity to come back for learning centers in core and also for community, which is a social emotional support for our students within the core program. Our comprehensive classes are aligned with our 300 level curriculum. They're modified in content. They are in all 4 of our subject core areas, and English language arts, math, science, and the humanities. When we are not able to have a duly certified teacher, because the majority of our classes do have duly certified teachers in special ed and general ed in the content area, we can adapt that design. And we have in our science program, for instance, this year, have a special education teacher and a content area teacher providing instruction in the comprehensive class. And our Excel program is our program that really leads up from our secondary program in Middlesex to also ensure that modified content, our vocational and life skills curriculum, and again, looking for those outside activities of job sites in the community as health and safety allows us to revisit those. Our accomplishments will continue with Dr. Friend, working on our including in-class remote coaching. We will look on finding new ways for platforms to really support and facilitate group models, including parallel lessons. We'll look very creative at community outings to make sure that our Excel classroom has those opportunities, whether we recreate them in the building, digitally, or move outside. And we'll look for some community job site visits twice per week as we have in the past when we're permitted. Future planning or mapping as we know it is really looking at a 5-year look out for students as we plan for their post-secondary opportunities also. We're very lucky. We were trained several teachers last year. We are looking forward to training more during this year when permitted, and having future planning ability to really work with families and all the stakeholders for those students, and really looking at what does high school look like, what does post-secondary look like. And our unified sports program, we're excited to say on the high school, we've had 20 practices this year during the soccer season. We've had large and small groups, 12 students participated, 6 athletes, 6 peer, and we're excited that we were able to begin at this time. In looking ahead for Darien High School, we'll continue with the implementation at Fitch and DHS for our group formats and implementation of learning centers. We'll look at addressing the emotional needs of our students with school refusal and school avoidance, and opportunities for our needs assessment and planning for this year and next year. And we'll also look at the idea of, as I said, training more staff for future planning meetings or mapping. And our district data for this year, as we noted on the bottom, the 2021 data has not yet been officially released. The timelines have been extended due to COVID, but we're just looking at what our data is that we will be submitting to the state. We're at 805 students, and that is pre-K through 12. Last year we had 811, so we've been pretty flat and stayed at the same number of supporting students. And when we look at educational classifications, and a question to come up a couple of years ago is, what is the prevalence within special education in Darien? The numbers have not changed. They're consistent with last year also. The majority of our students are either classified as other health impaired, learning disabilities, or speech and language, and the other prevalence in special education classifications you can see in the other areas of autism, emotional disturbance, intellectual disabilities, and other disabilities. And that are our highlights, our accomplishments, our challenges, and we are looking forward to another year of supporting students in Darien. Questions, and we will go back on, so we'll have our program directors there to answer as well.
Mrs. Klein, thank you very much. Just an incredible, a lot of work went into the detail in that presentation. And so a big thank you to you and your team. I know over and above your day job of taking care of all of our students, this is an incredible amount of work, so thank you. I would just throw out there to you in these times and everything that you've tried to do to continue to work with all our students, just as you go forward, think about what you may need in addition to what you are doing. I think there will be continued needs, continued remediation, continued time that you'll be looking for, that you'll need. And, I would ask that the administration and yourself think about, what those needs are to continue to stay ahead of and make sure we're delivering all these services to these students. But, thank you for the incredibly detailed presentation. And I'll open it up for board questions.
Thank you,
Mrs. McCammon.
I'll start with the elementary school SESS facilitators. I touched on this briefly. I know we'll talk about it during the budget season, and certainly from a sort of an administrative back to efficiency. I look forward to hearing about that then. But I also think there's a philosophical discussion that the board will have to have. When we put the facilitators in place as master teachers, the decision was made that we didn't want to have an assistant principal for special education and assistant principal for general education, that we wanted to be inclusive in the use of our administrators, and that we wanted to make sure that administratively we represented that idea of educational inclusion. So I hope that you will speak to us about that, and that we can, as a board, talk about our feelings or our strategy around making sure that inclusion is an underlying priority for our district.
Mrs. Parent. Did you want to say something, Mrs. Klein?
And yes, to Jill, and I did take Jill's
Sure.
comment last time when I reviewed everything. And yes, we will speak to that, Jill. I did go back and look at the original focus of the success facilitator, and in agreement with you, it was really about compliance and revision and filing a piece. I think when we do have a chance to present, it's their work was Herculean, but they were limited, and they didn't have the opportunity really about inclusion in the classroom, really supporting instruction, looking at SDI and being able to evaluate and observe teachers. So that's a piece I'd love to speak to when we do have the opportunity of how we think that will add to performance for students.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Mrs. Klein.
Thank
Mrs.
you.
Parent.
Mrs. Klein just touched on my question. I think as we go through that budget process and this idea comes up, I would love to just know how special education staff is being supervised now, given that they're clinicians and specialized, they have a lot of specialized instruction, and how is that teaching content being supervised by someone who does really know what's going on and not just a general education teacher. So I'd love to know more details about what's currently happening and why your idea would help those people out.
Thank you.
Mr. Maroney.
Yeah, to build on what you were asking, Duke, about funding. So my question is on the needs assessments that are being done at the elementary, middle, and high school. When do we expect to have those come back to the board for us to act on, possibly if needed?
I mean, I'll answer that if I may. I think the notion is it wouldn't be for next year. We're looking at really studying it for this year and for next year. We'd be looking probably for, once we have a needs assessment, and do a self-study for the year of 2022-23.
Mr. Cini.
Thanks for the presentation. One of the things that we've been hearing among finances in the shortfall is ELP enrollment. Is there a plan to kind of assess and analyze what the numbers are telling us related to that program and maybe the tuition?
Well, I'm not sure if you want me to answer, Laura Straighten here. Thank you again. This school year is a little bit lower than previous school years. People are cautiously entering into preschools, but our special ed numbers are pretty strong. And so, I think once people feel more secure in our COVID world, I think we'll be seeing an increase of children that pay for the program. Is that what you're asking?
Thank you, Mrs. Straighten. Any other, Mrs. McCammon?
Shirley, could you spend just a quick minute on the person-centered futures planning meetings and what exactly that is and what it represents in the continuum of services?
I certainly would be glad to. I am going to ask Scott to speak to it though, because he's worked with the teachers who are doing it at the high school at DHS for mapping.
Sure. Happy to speak about that. Person-centered planning is sort of the concept that, when we're working through a PPT process and IEP planning, we are most typically planning for a student for 1 year. And person-centered planning is really about thinking about that student in the context of their family, in the context of their community, in the context of where they'll be from 18 to 21 and where they'll be after 21, and trying to plan for them not just in the next year, but to think about the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and afterwards, and then bringing that back to the PPT or the IEP process and incorporating that sort of that information into the goal planning for those students. So in the past year, we trained 3 staff members in that process. It's not necessarily appropriate for every student, but certainly for students for whom we believe services will be required, especially past that sort of 18 to 21 range, it's really an essential part of the process. In the past, we have contracted out for person-centered planning and had person-centered planning experts come in to work with those teams of both educators, families, and the student to help come up with plans for those families. And what we wanted to do is make sure that wasn't just sort of a sort of a one and done process, and that it could actually be brought in as part of our planning for students throughout their educational career.
And Scott, if I may just add one thing to that, Jill, we've had the opportunity to work with the attendees that are part of the mapping process, or the person really, it's not too early to do it. We can also do it in middle school. We've had opportunities to do middle school as well as we transition to high school. But some of the attendees that I've been able to have the experience of working with are parents who participate in the planning, grandparents who participate, teachers that the kids have had years ago. I had teachers who come up from elementary school to be there as well. Paras and speech therapists have been there. So it really is looking at all the stakeholders who know the child, who can help really design what that mapping looks like, as Scott said, in preparing that 5-year look out.
Thank you. I think that's really exciting for our kids.
Great, Mrs. Achman.
Mrs. Klein, you and really anyone on your team, can you talk a little bit about the unique nature of this year and some of the changes the department has had to do, especially for our learners who might really require the most kind of interface in order to get their education in an environment that's prohibitive? I mean, I believe this team can do it better than any other team anywhere, but could you kind of just explain for the board and the public some of the things you've had to do and adjust during this COVID time?
I'll start and then I'll turn it over, because I think we all want to add to it, Ms. Achman. But I think to start with, as we said earlier on, it was really shifting everything that we know and how we work with kids. It was also moving from, I'll do practice as a really related service. So in some of our design, we really need to be close to our students when we're working with them. So in the lens of a speech pathologist who really needs to be right next to a student as she is working with them, or he, you didn't have that opportunity. You had to find a way to have that kind of proximity without having proximity. You had to find a way really engaging in the teaching and learning that goes on in the speech session, and not have that kind of opportunity to really shape a child's face or be able to really model that. So looking at it from a discipline point of view, and the discipline of speech and pathology, they had some extraordinary challenges and they managed them. When you look at some of the, I know we did some e-learning back in the spring of last year or toward the end of the year of what it looked like. They came up with tools, they came up with designs, they came up with different ways of telling parents how to support their children at home. So I think to begin the conversation that you asked, Tara, was what they had to come up with mechanisms and opportunities in remote learning to be able to go through the screen. They had to be able to do parent training to help the parent do what they weren't able to do. So if they couldn't shape the child's face, they needed the parent to help and assist with that. They had to enlist the help of paras once they were trained and able to do that, to reinforce and practice some of the activities they were doing. So they reshaped their entire way of speech and language pathology and did it in an amazing short period of time. We're almost excited about it. I remember we showed you one picture where she was actually excited about the opportunities when the child recorded themselves and was able to show what they could do. So I think it was that kind of redesigning instruction within speech and language pathology. That's just one example I was thinking of. I'll open it up to everyone who wants to jump in, because we all have one extraordinary story of what we saw.
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. I was going to mimic sort of the same sentiment that I think sort of the group of people that encompass special educators already tend to be very creative problem solvers. And I think we've seen that more now than ever during COVID, really utilizing, different technology platforms, thinking through student groupings in a really unique way, and navigating what we know to be, a scenario where delivering our instruction and our services in person is the ideal. And there are times in which we haven't been able to do that. And we've had to be really creative and work really closely with families and students and staff to make sure that we're delivering those services in the best way possible. And it's interesting too, I think, sort of outside of or in addition to the scope of the work that our special educators do directly with our students, there are other parts of the special education process that has had to change as well, right? So we've gone to remote PPTs really at the drop of a hat, and we've been navigating that process all along and have been very successful in that, in addition to prioritizing and sort of making up these evaluations that were halted back in the spring, and really thinking through what do kids need right now when we return to school in the fall, and what can we do to help evaluate students given, you know, all of these sort of restrictions that we have around that process. So I mimic, you know, what Shirley was saying, that I think as a team we feel incredibly proud to work with colleagues who have really sort of risen to the occasion and have gone above and beyond for the students in this community.
Yeah, and I can just add to that too. You know, I think from an instructional perspective, when we think about what we expect during instruction, we expect that you know, a staff member is going to introduce an objective to the classroom. They're going to then model what the expectation is. Then they're going to provide independent practice, and then at the end of the lesson, they're going to provide some kind of, you know, what we would call like an exit ticket to find out if the students have mastered the content, so they can adjust their next lessons. And so what we're seeing so frequently is that you know, last year, a teacher who might be able to sort of kind of walk by and quickly do a quick formative assessment and determine whether the student is getting it in the middle of the class isn't really finding out until the end of the class because they're staying at the front. And so we're seeing the instructional challenges of being physically distanced from students be, you know, needed to be solved very creatively with using technology and you know, spacing students in different ways. And all the while, you're also trying to manage some students who are home. So all of that instructionally is very challenging. But I will also say that we have emotionally a really difficult problem even to assess. So we have students who in the past we know, you know, were classically school phobic or school refusers who are able by regulation right now to stay home. So we don't know what that will look like when they are required to come back to school. And then at the same time, some of them would like to come to school, and the interventions we would typically employ, like home visits and home coaching, we can't employ right now. And so the need for pretty extensive community collaboration has kind of come to the surface there. And I think last, the sort of the social connection has been so hard to replicate. And, you know, to echo a quote from Ellen Dunn, you know, nobody is able to sort of go on Amazon and buy the book of how to teach during a pandemic. And so it's really looking at who's doing it well, and being able to share those experiences with your colleagues to say, this is how you can do it, and to be able to figure out, how do I connect with this remote learner who's not coming to school right now, and actually make them feel connected into my classroom. And so this real, you know, need for true collaboration across colleagues to figure out, how do we do this in a way that feels authentic for kids and feels authentic for our remote learners, feels authentic during hybrid, and feels authentic during a physically distanced classroom environment, which wasn't designed to be that way. So I just think this, as Kristen said, this, you know, this creativity that we've seen in terms of instruction and in terms of collaboration and in terms of, you know, trying to make people feel as connected as possible has just really been incredible.
Thank you all.
Can I just add to that, just only because, I mean, perhaps our children with the greatest needs are in an environment where it's probably the hardest thing to deliver in some ways. These people are absolutely phenomenal. And the main thing I would say is not only their skill, their dedication, but the care and devotion that they exhibit to our children is just, it's just unbelievable. And more than anything, I want to pay tribute to that, because to find a way to do that during these times is particularly difficult and most needed. So to my administrative team, but honestly to all the people on the front lines for Special Education Support Service, just a huge thank you for all the special things and the extra mile that they have gone, because it just truly is remarkable. But thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adley. Any further questions or comments from the board? Mr. Maroney?
Yeah, so on your last slide, you show that there's a roughly 18 or 19% increase over the last 5 years of students who are having special education services delivered. And to that, I say that's a wonderful statistic, that because I think our enrollment has been relatively flat. It hasn't increased over 18%. So we're identifying more children who have needs. And my question is, what is causing that? Is it just this group of children have more needs? Is it we've had better training to identify the needs, or we've developed better testing methods to identify, or a combination of all?
I think we've looked at this, Mr. Murray, over the past. There actually have been some what were considered some times where there were. I remember last year I spoke to, there were 68 students that moved in that had IEPs, if you recall. There are different trends that happen where students move in. I don't know that that it's a result of that we're better at what we're doing. I'd like to believe that we've been over the last 5 years consistent in our practices and best practices and evaluations. I do think that the trend has been consistent in Connecticut, and if you look at the trends, and we will be able to show you that once it's published for 2021, it's not published yet, that the increases happen steadfastly across Connecticut. I think maybe referrals are made and people are more comfortable about making referrals. I think that might be true also for practitioners as well as families. I think that our methodologies for evaluation are consistent. I think our working to support kids with our SRBI and our pre-referral is consistent. So I think if you look at the trends, they're consistent with the state, and I can't give you a reason of how it happened, although you gave 5 wonderful reasons why it could happen, but I can't speak to if those would be responsible for the trend and the increase over the years.
Mrs. Ritchie.
Thank you. Thank you all for the presentation, and I echo Dr. Adley's comments. I thank you for the presentation. I thank you for your passion, your hard work, and to all the teachers, thank you, especially during this time. It's so difficult and challenging. Shirley, I'm just wondering, you gave us the total IEPs. I'm wondering if we could just have a breakdown for pre-K, elementary, middle, and high school.
I can actually forward that to Dr. Adley and give it to you. Our CDEC reporting is broken down that way. It actually does ELP, K5, Middlesex, so I can certainly ask Dr. Adley to share that with you. We have our CDEC numbers that are going to go to the state.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I will echo Dr. Adley's comment, and thank you, Mrs. Klein, Mr. McCarthy, Ms. O'Reilly, and Mrs. Straighten for your time tonight and all the hard work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, discussion and no update on trying to move the agenda along. Update on 2020-21 district goals.
Well,
Dr.
Mr. Chairman,
Adley.
I will help you move the agenda along with us. Actually, a lot of these issues you've been living them, so I'm not going to really. I'll touch them. Like, I'm particularly proud of the district of its ability to stay open for as long as it has, to lead in the sense of how we did open up. I'm not going to go through all those things. The strategic planning, you know, kind of where we are in that process. The district facility projects are, you kind of know where we are there too. All of these projects are front and center. The transportation, to bring out the closure, and the teaching and learning has really been focused on revising curriculum and instructional practices for the new environment, provision of professional learning opportunities for staff, and the revision of the evaluation process. All of these things in some capacity have come before the board. So that's really your December update. I'll be happy to entertain questions.
I'll open it for board questions or comments. Mrs. Ritchie.
Thank you. My comment is I love this format. I think it's great. I hope that this is what we're going to see every month. I really do think this is a great summarization of everything going on. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. McCammon.
Just quickly, the Professional Development and Evaluation Committee, can you just give
Yes.
a little brief on that, please?
That has been established, and I'll let Mr. Kramberg talk about it. It has been established.
So the Professional Development and Evaluation Committee, often referred to as PDEC. So if you hear PDEC, that's what we can add it to the acronym list. It's made up of about 45 teachers and administrators across the district. The group is we're required to have the group, and they look at two major things. One of them is the teacher evaluation and feedback program and the professional development program that exists within districts, and how those two things work together, because they should. Right now, this is an exceptional year, obviously, but we met last month. We looked at the feedback that teachers provided from our November professional development day, and we're using that to inform the PD as we move on through the rest of the year.
Any other board questions or comments? Okay, moving along. Discussion and possible action on proposed revisions to Board Policy 5125, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and repeal of Board Policy 5810, student use of the district's computer systems and internet safety, and proposed revised Policy 5810, student use of the district's computer systems and internet safety. These have come to the board and we have reviewed them and asked questions. I'll move to a motion to approve the proposed revisions to Board Policy 5125, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and repeal of Board Policy 5810, student use of the district's computer systems and internet safety, and proposed revised Policy 5810, student use of the district's computer systems and internet safety. Do I have a motion? Mrs. Parent, the second. Mrs. Ritchie, all those in favor?
Would you like to take any questions before?
Okay, sure. Questions, comments? Thank you, Jill. I see Mrs. Stein. We'll do just hands raised again. All those in favor? That is unanimous. Thank you. We're moving to action items. Yep, personnel items. This is Sion.
So people continue to come and go from the district, but fewer and fewer, and we were able to fill one of the tech positions, the COVID positions that the board approved.
Motion to approve the personnel items as detailed in the personnel action report dated December 8th, 2020. Motion, Mr. Brown, second, Mrs. Ackman, all in favor? I see Mrs. Stein there, motion approved. Just real quickly, just on behalf of the board, happy holidays to everyone out
No,
there.
you're not done yet.
What? Where are we going?
We need to vote on the contract.
Oh, go ahead.
Here.
Next. See, I'm trying to really move it along. Sorry, contract between the Darien Board of Education and the United Public Service Employees Union paraprofessionals.
Mark, you want to speak that real quick?
Yeah, so the general wage increase of 2.25 in each of 3 years of the contract, a 1% increase in the premium share in each year of the contract. Both sides got language changes that are beneficial to both. And this is an incredibly dedicated group of people who work for us, some of them with our most complicated children. And I think that everyone was happy with this settlement.
Questions? Motion to approve the contract between the Darien Board of Education and the United Public Services Employees Union. Do I have a motion? Mr. Maroney, second by Mr. Sini. All those in favor? That is unanimous. Thank you. Item 9, discussion on student board representatives. Dr. Adley.
I'd just like to bring this proposal before the board for their consideration. Not consideration would be to add to the board's composition with 2 student representatives. I think it's a tremendous opportunity for the young people, leadership opportunity for them. And I think it adds a lot to boards of education. This is not unusual in districts to have student representation. Typically what it might look like is you have a junior and a senior, and then, you know, when the senior graduates, the junior takes up the different position. They do not vote on the board. They do not enter into executive session. They typically would report out every month just what's going on across the district. They have the responsibility to coordinate that, not just speak for the high school. And I think it's an opportunity whenever we're talking about programs and policies and practices that happen, you get a real flavor. Let me tell you that the two children who were on, the two students who were on the steering committee, strategic planning committee, they just added so much in terms of just reality, right? And they just brought so much to the table, and I think you'll find that they will bring a lot to the board table too. So at this point, I'm just doing a preliminary discussion with you just as to how much interest there might be in the board to actually do that.
Thank you, Dr. Audley. Comments and questions from the board. Mr. Sini.
I support the idea. I just would love to see their role defined more formally.
Sure, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you. Mr. Maroney.
I echo Mr. Sini.
Thank you, Mr. Maroney.
Duke, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
I support it. I don't think we're ready to vote on it necessarily as an action item yet. I would love to see laid out how the students will be selected, and to your earlier discussion, Dr. Adley, is it a 1-year term? Is it 2 years? So it's sort of more details about it, but I think it's phenomenal. And having sat on the strategic planning, those students were invaluable.
Mrs. Parent.
I was just going to echo Katie's last comment that sitting on the strategic planning committee, having those two students, they really added a knowledge that none of us have. And I think it was a very important part of that process. So I'm for this idea and agree with all the other questions. A little more detail would be helpful.
Great. I think it's a great idea. If you just go back to some of the conversations we had this evening about different things, and I think several people raised the topic of reaching out to students and hearing what their thoughts are on some of the topics we discussed tonight. So I think it's an excellent idea. So we'll continue to look forward to more information on that, Dr. Adler. At this point, I'll open it back up to public comment.
If you would like to speak during public comment, click the participants icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Next, click the raise hand option. You will notice a blue hand icon appear in the upper corner of your screen where your face, name, or number appears. When it is your turn to speak, the facilitator will identify you and announce that you are unmuted for public comment. Once recognized and unmuted, please state your name and address. You will have up to 3 minutes to comment. There is no one for comment. Oh, we have one. Jocelyn Delancey, you are unmuted and recognized.
I feel like I need to comment and address tone and tenor towards the teachers that I really think is unmerited. Every day, our teachers have concerns. We express them professionally, and we come in with fears, anxieties, whatever they are regarding COVID and exposure and quarantining and the sacrifices we make. And we come in every day and have every day since the start of the school year to give your children 100% and more. Darien has gotten more in-person learning than most districts in the state and probably in the tri-state area. And we give and we give and we give. Right now, we have a very reactive approach to COVID, and it's costing us, your teachers and your students. And we are asking for a short-term, proactive approach where we can address some of our concerns and really allow for the district to take care of the people who are putting themselves out there every day, giving no matter what, regardless. There are other teaching unions, local ones in our state, who are, questioning sick outs and other things. And professionally, we aren't doing that. We don't want that for our students. We want the very best, very best. And if we were remote, we would be live. We would give 100% and more again. We don't have an agenda. It's to keep everybody safe, give quality education, and be proactive and have an approach that supports all learners, remote, in person, wherever they are. We're not on an even playing field right now, and we want to do that for everybody. And we would like for you to consider that. I also really need for you to understand that your teachers feel that many parents and families are taking us for granted. And we would like for you to understand that a little care and consideration is so much needed right now, especially approaching the holidays. So thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Delancey. With that, on behalf of the board, I wish everyone out there happy holidays. Please continue to be mindful of COVID and safety precautions. Thank you for all that you've done to keep our schools open and to keep as many of our students in school as possible. I think a big shout out to our teachers, our staff, our administrators, parents and students for all the hard work they continue to do to continue to try to come to school and learn, grow, and develop. A big thank you to the groups that support us in the schools, CDSP, the PTOs, CPAC, and a shout out to Corbin Cares. I know there's a lot of activity going on around there of providing meals and dinners and luncheons, all really good stuff to show the support and the love that we have for our teachers, our students, and our staff out there. So thank you very much to all those people supporting all those programs, and a happy and safe holiday to all. Thank you. With that, motion to adjourn. Mrs. Parent, second. Mrs.